The temperature was negative 23 degrees when they left her. No flare, no final radio check, no argument about it. Sergeant Riley Hart had gone into the ravine. That much her team confirmed. Whether she came out was a question nobody waited around to answer. Her commanding officer gave the order in 9 words, and 9 words was all it took to abandon a soldier in the dark. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Riley had already stopped counting the ways she might die. She was already counting something else entirely. If this story stays with you, follow along and watch it through to the end. Like this video, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The fall lasted 4 seconds. Riley Hart knew this because she counted them. 1, 2, 3, 4. The same way she counted everything under pressure. Heartbeats. Footsteps. Seconds between a muzzle flash and the sound of a shot. 4 seconds of freefall meant roughly 30 feet of vertical drop, give or take the angle of the slope. Her brain processed that calculation even as her body cartwheeled through frozen air, even as the rocky face of the ravine tore at her left arm and her right boot caught something solid and spun her sideways. And then the ground arrived like a concrete slab swung by something that had no interest in whether she lived or died. She hit the bottom on her left side. The impact drove the air out of her lungs in a single brutal compression, and for 3 seconds, she counted those too. There was nothing. Not pain, not cold, not thought. Just the cessation of everything, the way a television screen goes dark between channels. Then the pain arrived. It came in from her lower left leg first, a shrieking white-hot signal that her nervous system couldn't translate fast enough, and her body's response was to curl inward around it the way a hand closes around a burning coal. She didn't scream. The reflex to scream was there, her throat tightened around it, her jaw clenched. But what came out instead was a single compressed sound, barely louder than a breath, that she exhaled into the snow beneath her face. Snow. That registered next. She was face down in snow. She was breathing. Both of those facts mattered more than the pain, so she filed the pain in a different part of her mind and focused on the facts that were actionable. Breathing, face down, left leg compromised, weapon status unknown. She moved her right hand first, testing. Her fingers responded. She pressed them into the snow and pushed, rolling herself fractionally onto her right side, and the movement sent a fresh pulse of agony up through her left leg that forced her eyes shut for a moment. She kept her teeth together, opened her eyes again. Above her, 30 feet of sheer rock face and ice, and beyond the lip of the ravine, nothing. No silhouettes, no lights, no voices. The blizzard had swallowed the rim completely. Riley lay still for 60 seconds and listened. Wind, the deep percussive groan of ice somewhere further down the ravine, contracting in the cold. The distant, barely perceptible creak of her own heartbeat in her ears. Nothing else. No one was coming to look over the edge. No one was shouting her name into the dark. She had known, somewhere in the back of her mind, that this was a possibility, not a probability. She hadn't let herself frame it as a probability, but she'd known. There were things about this mission that had felt wrong from the pre-op briefing, small things, the kind that didn't add up to anything concrete but that her instincts had cataloged and filed without her permission. The last-minute route change. The way Captain Mercer had avoided her eyes during the mission brief. The radio frequencies she'd been given that didn't match the ones on the verified encryption list she'd memorized the week prior. She'd almost said something. She hadn't. That decision sat with her now, at the bottom of a frozen ravine in the dark, and she let herself acknowledge it for exactly 5 seconds before she set it aside. Regret was a weight she couldn't afford to carry right now. She had a broken leg. She was nearly certain it was broken. The fibula at minimum, possibly the tibia. She had no confirmed extraction window, and she was in negative 23-degree temperatures wearing gear rated for extended cold weather operations but not for immobility. The moment she stopped moving, she would start dying in earnest. So she moved. The first order of business was the leg. She couldn't walk on it. She'd established that within the first 30 seconds of attempting to stand, when her left boot had taken weight and the pain response had been severe enough to make her vision blur at the edges. She sat back down in the snow and breathed through her nose until her vision cleared, then unclipped her pack with her right hand and started taking inventory. Cold weather kit. Emergency bivy. 3 days of rations, She wouldn't need those, she told herself, because she wouldn't be out here 3 days. She said it plainly, in her head, the way you'd state a fact about geography. Trauma kit, pressure bandage, tourniquet, hemostatic gauze, 2 morphine auto-injectors in a foil sleeve. She looked at the morphine for a moment, then she put it back. Morphine would dull the pain, and the pain was currently the loudest piece of sensory data she had. Pain told her what her leg could and couldn't tolerate. Pain kept her from doing something that would make the injury catastrophically worse. She needed that information. The morphine could wait until she had no other choice, and she wasn't there yet. She found 2 tent poles in the bottom of the pack, lightweight, collapsible aluminum, and she used them and her boot knife and the strap from her secondary pack to improvise a splint. It took 11 minutes. She tracked the time on the watch on her right wrist, the one with the cracked crystal that she'd been meaning to get replaced for 4 months. 11 minutes of working with cold, stiffened fingers in the dark, pulling straps tight against a limb that screamed at every adjustment. And when she was done, it wasn't elegant, but it held. She stood up again. This time, with the splint and a careful distribution of weight toward her right side, she stayed up. She stood at the bottom of the ravine in the howling black and took stock of what she had, what she knew, and what she needed to do. What she had: her rifle, a Mark 18 CQBR with 1 full magazine and a partial. She'd expended rounds during the contact that preceded the fall, and she counted what remained, 31 rounds total. Her sidearm, a SIG P226 with 2 magazines, her knife, her GPS unit, which was showing a signal but whose screen had spiderwebbed in the fall, her radio. She keyed the radio. Static. She tried the primary frequency. Nothing. She switched to the secondary, the one that hadn't matched the verified list, and held the transmit button for 3 seconds without speaking, just to listen for a carrier signal. Nothing came back. She tried the emergency frequency that every soldier memorized regardless of mission-specific comms protocols. 3 seconds of static, and then, faint and broken, a carrier tone. Not a voice. Just the tone that meant a frequency was active somewhere on the other end. She didn't transmit. Not yet. She put the radio back on her chest rig and looked up at the ravine wall. She couldn't climb it. Not with this leg. Not in the dark. Not on an ice-sheeted rock face with a rifle and a pack. She would have to follow the ravine floor until it shallowed out enough to exit. She pulled up the cracked GPS screen and studied it in the dim backlight. The ravine ran roughly northeast. If she followed it for approximately 2 kilometers, it would open onto a slope that would eventually bring her out onto the eastern face of the mountain. The eastern face was where Fort Black Hollow sat. She looked at the GPS for a long moment. The mission objective, the reconnaissance objective, the one that had sent her team up here in the first place, had been to observe Fort Black Hollow from the ridgeline. Observe, collect, and report. Not engage. Command had been very specific about that. Command had also very specifically told her team to verify whether any personnel had gone into the ravine before withdrawing. She thought about that. Then she shouldered her pack, adjusted the improvised splint against the inside of her boot, and started walking northeast. The going was slow and it was brutal, and she didn't let herself think about how slow it was or how brutal it was. She thought about the mission. She thought about the terrain. She thought about what she knew about Fort Black Hollow from the intelligence briefings, turning the data over in her mind like pieces of a problem she was already halfway through solving. Fort Black Hollow. Designated enemy command installation. Black Ridge Mountain Range, grid reference, November Foxtrot 774. Confirmed garrison strength, approximately 200 personnel, a mix of regular military and specialized units. Surface defensive perimeter, concertina wire, fixed guard posts at 300 and approximately 60-degree intervals based on aerial imagery from 12 days prior. Vehicle pool. Armored personnel carriers, logistics trucks, and this had been flagged in the brief as a high-confidence assessment, a battery of long-range artillery that had been moved into the area over the preceding 3 weeks. That artillery was the reason her team had been sent up here. Allied command positions were approximately 40 kilometers southwest. If the artillery was what the intelligence suggested it was, and Riley had no particular reason to doubt the assessment, those positions were well within range. The question was timing. When was the battery going to be used, and against what specific targets? She walked. The ravine floor was uneven and treacherous in the dark. ice-slicked rock broken up by drifts of wind-packed snow that could conceal a 2-foot drop or a 4-foot drop with equal anonymity. She fell twice in the first 20 minutes. The first time she caught herself on her right hand and knee. The second time she went down harder. Her left leg caught a hidden lip in the rock, and the jolt sent such a violent spike of pain through the splint that she lay in the snow for 90 seconds and breathed through it with her eyes closed. When she opened them again, there was a faint change in the quality of the darkness ahead. Not light, not exactly, more the absence of the absolute black of solid rock walls, a slightly less dense dark that suggested the ravine was beginning to widen. She fixed on it and kept moving. The wind was picking up. The blizzard had been bad on the ridgeline, and it was no less bad down here, channeled by the ravine walls into something with more velocity and less patience. She pulled her balaclava down fully over her face and kept her head angled down into the wind and walked. Her left leg had gone from screaming to a deep, rhythmic ache that she could work around. That was either the cold numbing the nerves, the splint doing its job, or the early stages of something worse. She preferred the first two explanations and held on to them. 40 minutes into the walk, she stopped. She stopped because she heard something. It was there, and then it wasn't. Just a break in the wind, a fraction of a second where the gusts eased enough that a different sound came through. Footsteps. Boots on ice, not far. She was against the ravine wall before the thought fully completed. Rifle up, barrel tracking toward the direction the sound had come from. Nothing moved. She stayed still for 3 minutes. The sound didn't repeat. Could have been debris shifted by the wind. Could have been an animal. There were mountain goats in this range, and she'd read that they moved around in weather like this. Could have been something else entirely. She lowered the rifle and kept moving, but she moved slower now, and she put her feet down with more deliberate care. The ravine opened at the 1.8-kilometer mark, close enough to her GPS estimate that she felt a small, grim satisfaction at the confirmation. The walls dropped away to either side, and the terrain flattened into a broad, wind-scoured bowl that led upslope toward the eastern face of the mountain. She crouched at the transition point and did a slow 360 scan with the rifle before she moved into the open. The fortress was ahead and above her. She could see it now. Not the structure itself, which was still obscured by the weather and the darkness and the slope of the terrain, but its presence. A smear of artificial light against the cloud base above, the kind of light that came from a facility with significant power generation. Guard post lights, interior buildings bleeding illumination through gaps in the structure. A large installation. She found a position behind a rock outcrop about 40 meters from the base of the slope and sat down to think for a moment. The original plan had been simple. Observe from the ridgeline, which was why it had required a team. Ground-level observation of a fortified position was a different problem entirely. Perimeter guards, fields of fire, sensor coverage. The intelligence briefings had mentioned passive infrared units at the gate checkpoints, though the coverage areas of any internal sensors were unknown. She had 31 rounds in her rifle and 2 pistol magazines. She had a broken leg. She had no radio contact and no confirmed extraction. She stayed behind the rock for a while and thought about what she was about to do. And the longer she thought about it, the more certain she became that she was going to do it anyway. The artillery battery was the mission. Somewhere inside that fortress, someone had a schedule and a set of target coordinates, and those coordinates led to Allied positions where soldiers were sleeping or standing watch right now without any idea that something was pointed at them. She also couldn't know how much time she had. She found a position that let her watch the nearest guard post for 15 minutes. She was looking for the rotation schedule. Every post had one. Even the most disciplined garrison got lazy about post-rotation in bad weather, because bad weather was physically and psychologically draining, and when humans were cold and miserable, they fell into the comfort of routine. If she could establish the interval, she could work with it. The relief came at the 13-minute mark. 2 guards came from the interior, and the 2 guards at the post met them halfway. A brief exchange. She was too far to hear anything over the wind, and then the original pair moved toward the interior, while the new pair took position. 13 minutes. Which meant the rotation was either a 15-minute cycle with a 2-minute travel buffer, or the outgoing guards were moving slow because of the weather. She'd assumed 15 to be conservative. 15 minutes was enough. She moved. She'd done close quarters work before. Everyone in her specialty had. But there was a difference between controlled training scenarios and a frozen mountainside at negative 23 degrees with a compromised leg and a solo operational situation that had no legitimate mission authorization whatsoever. She was not supposed to be here. Nobody was waiting for her report. If she died in the next hour, it was entirely plausible that her body wouldn't be found until spring. She kept that thought at arm's length and moved along the perimeter wire. The first guard she encountered was not at a post. He was at the south side of the perimeter, relieving himself against the exterior of a supply shed, rifle slung behind him. He heard her 1 second before she reached him. She saw his shoulders tense, saw his right hand start to come around, and she covered the last 2 meters in an ugly, limping rush that her leg protested violently, and she hit him from behind with enough force to take them both into the wall of the shed. He was larger than her by a significant margin, and he had bulk and surprise working for him, even despite the surprise being mutual at this point. And what followed was not clean. It wasn't a clean, smooth, controlled takedown. It was approximately 12 seconds of brutal, close-quarter struggling in the dark, his elbow catching her jaw hard enough to make her ears ring, her splinted leg taking a strike that sent white noise flooding across her vision. And then she had leverage and angle, and she used them, and it was over. She held position against the shed wall, breathing hard. Her jaw hurt. Her leg was telling her things she didn't want to hear. She dragged the guard into the shadow of the shed and moved on. The second guard she found at a post on the west side of the perimeter. This time she had the approach angle working for her. The wind was in her face, which meant the guard's back was to the weather, which meant his hearing was compromised and his attention was directed inward toward the compound rather than outward into the dark where she was coming from. She made it to within 3 meters before he turned. He turned because he heard something. He turned and he saw her, or he saw enough of her, a shape in the dark that wasn't weather. And she saw him pull breath to shout, and she closed the distance in a single motion, and the shout didn't happen. She stood in the dark beside the post and listened for 60 seconds. Nothing changed. No alarm. No shouts from inside the compound. The blizzard kept doing what it was doing, which was making everything loud enough to cover a multitude of sins. She found the gap in the wire that the guards used for their perimeter walk. There was always a gap, because perimeter wire was designed to keep people out, not to inconvenience the people who lived inside it. And she went through it, and she was inside Fort Black Hollow. The compound was larger than the aerial imagery had suggested. Intelligence photos had a way of compressing scale. From altitude, a building looked smaller than it was. A courtyard looked tighter than it was. On the ground, the interior of the fortress was a series of low utilitarian structures arranged around a central area that was too open to be crossed without exposure, even in the blizzard. She worked the perimeter of the interior, staying close to the exterior walls of the buildings, using the structures themselves as cover. The lights she'd seen from below were exterior flood lamps on poles, several of them, positioned to illuminate the open central area. Between the buildings, there were shadows deep enough to move through. She moved. The armory was the first priority, not the communications center, not yet. The armory, because the armory was where the artillery rounds were staged, and because a battery without its ammunition was a very different problem than a battery with full stores. She found it by logic and layout, the heaviest construction, the widest vehicle access, the position within the compound that would make logistical sense for something that needed to receive and distribute large quantities of heavy ordnance. She found it in the northeast corner of the compound, a reinforced structure with double doors wide enough for a truck, a secondary personnel entrance on the south face, and a guard post that was currently occupied by one person who was standing inside the shelter of the doorway rather than outside in the weather. She watched the guard for a moment. He was young. She couldn't tell how young, exactly. The distance and the darkness and the weather made it difficult. But there was something in his posture that read as young. The way he was hunched, the way his attention kept drifting inward toward warmth and routine, rather than outward toward threat assessment. She noted it without making it mean anything and worked around to the secondary entrance. The personnel door was unlocked. She registered that as an intelligence data point rather than as luck. Unlocked doors inside a perimeter were either sloppy operations or deliberate convenience for personnel who moved between buildings frequently. The armory had both heavy lock infrastructure on the main vehicle doors and routine through traffic through the personnel entrance, The second option made more sense. Inside, the smell hit her first. Machine oil and propellant and the particular metallic cold of stored metal in an unheated space. She let her eyes adjust. The armory was stacked, not just small arms. The entire right side of the interior was given over to munitions crates, stacked floor to ceiling in configurations that she read immediately as artillery ordnance. 155 millimeter, based on the crate dimensions. Dozens of them. She moved through the space carefully, reading labels in the minimal light that came through a single dirty skylight. Her translation of the stenciled markings was imperfect. She had functional working knowledge of the language, not fluency, but she could read dates and quantities well enough to understand that this was not a prepositioned stock. This was an active deployment stage. Recent delivery dates on the crates, high volume. Someone was planning to use this material soon. She found the detonators in a smaller subroom behind a metal door that was locked with a padlock, which she opened with the pick set in the breast pocket of her cold weather jacket. The subroom held detonators, fuses, and proximity charges. She stood in that room for a moment and looked at what she had available to her and thought carefully about how much she was willing to do without authorization. Then she started working. She was not authorized to destroy the armory. She was not authorized to be inside the compound at all. But she was looking at enough artillery ammunition to level a significant portion of whatever was on the other end of those target coordinates. And she was working on the assumption that the target coordinates were Allied positions, and that assumption felt solid enough to work from. She planted 2 charges, small ones. Not in the ordnance itself, she had no desire to blow herself and the entire compound apart, but in the detonator subroom, positioned to destroy the fusing systems without initiating a catastrophic secondary explosion in the main ordnance stack. If the artillery couldn't be fuse set, it couldn't be fired. That would buy time. Time was what she needed most. She was almost through the personnel door on her way out when she heard the voices. 2 soldiers, from the sound of it. Coming along the north wall of the armory, moving without any particular urgency, one of them saying something in a low voice that the other answered with a short laugh. Not a patrol with tactical intent, just 2 men walking between buildings, cutting close to the armory wall for the marginal wind shelter it provided. She went still inside the doorway and pressed herself to the wall and waited. Their boots passed within 2 meters of the personnel door. One of them said something. She caught one word, a phrase she recognized from her language training, something about coffee or hot water. The context was ambiguous, and the other one responded, and they kept walking. She waited until the sound of them faded before she moved. Outside, back in the compound, she reoriented toward the communications center. The layout she was building in her head from observation and inference put it on the south side. The structure with the antenna clusters on the roofline that she'd clocked when she first came through the perimeter wire. The antennae were visible even in the blizzard because they were lit with red warning lights, a smear of dim crimson in the snow blur above the roofline. She was 40 meters from the comms building when the radio on her chest rig, set to receive only, transmit locked out, picked up a burst of traffic. She stopped. The traffic was on the secondary frequency, the one that hadn't matched her verified list. It was short, encoded, and she couldn't decipher it in real time, but the signal strength told her something. It was coming from inside the compound, which meant someone inside Fort Black Hollow was transmitting on a frequency that had been provided to her team by their own command structure. She stood in the snow and let that sit with her for a moment. Then she unslung her rifle and kept moving toward the communications building. Okay. The comms center had 2 personnel at the exterior door rather than 1. She watched them for several minutes from a position behind a maintenance vehicle, a heavy truck with its engine off and its cab coated in a layer of ice. The 2 guards were not being lazy. They were talking to each other, which was human and predictable, but their weapons were in their hands rather than slung, and they were maintaining an awareness of the space around them that suggested they were not the sloppy minimum vigilance guards she'd dealt with at the perimeter. These 2 were protecting something that mattered. She worked backward from the door, looking for another approach. The comms building had no windows on the south face. Communications facilities often didn't, for signal integrity and physical security reasons. The north face was presumably where the antenna infrastructure was rooted and would have its own access challenges. The east face backed up against the interior wall of the compound's perimeter. Tight spacing, minimal room to maneuver, but minimal exposure. She went east. The spacing between the comms building and the perimeter wall was approximately 1.5 meters, enough to move through sideways, pressing close to the wall. The east face of the building had a single door, heavy construction, and a keypad lock rather than a physical one. She looked at the keypad for a moment and thought about her options. Keypads with high-frequency use wore the most pressed buttons down in ways that were sometimes visible under the right light conditions. She had a pen light. She shielded it with her hand and clicked it on for 2 seconds, directing the beam at the keypad at an oblique angle. 4 buttons showed more wear than the others. That gave her a maximum of 24 possible combinations for a 4-digit code. Less if any digit repeated. She had at most 10 attempts before the system would likely lock out. Some systems gave you 3, some gave you 10. She didn't know which this was, so she'd budget for 3 and treat anything beyond that as borrowed luck. She thought about what she knew about operational security habits. People chose codes they could remember under stress. Meaningful dates, sequential patterns, repeating digits. She thought about the patterns that were universal across military installations of every nation she'd ever read intel on. She tried the most wear-heavy button 4 times. The door opened. She stood in the doorway and stared at the unlock status indicator for a moment, and then she went inside and pulled the door closed behind her. The interior of the communications center was warm. It was the first warmth she'd felt since the fall, and her body's response to it was immediate and involuntary. A deep, full-body shudder that moved through her from her core outward, her muscles dumping the tension they'd been holding against the cold. She kept moving through it, didn't let herself stop and stand in the warmth, because stopping would be dangerous. Warmth after extended cold was seductive in ways that could slow a person down without them realizing it. The room she'd entered was a corridor that ran the length of the building. Doors on either side, storage from the look of the first 2 she checked. At the far end, light and the sound of equipment. She moved the length of the corridor with her back to the wall and her rifle in a compressed carry that let her move through the tight space without sweeping the muzzle into door frames. The far door was ajar. She pressed herself to the wall beside it and looked through the gap. The main communications room was roughly 10 meters by 8. Banks of equipment along 2 walls, radio sets, encryption modules, what looked like a signals intelligence monitoring station along the left wall. 4 workstations. At this hour, 3 of them were occupied. 3 operators. One of them was young, maybe 22, working a radio set with the automatic competence of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. The second was older, heavy-set, eating something from a container and watching a screen with the expression of someone watching something boring. The third was not at his station. He was standing at the far side of the room with his back to her, reading something pinned to a board on the wall. The thing pinned to the board was a map. She could see it from the doorway. The scale, the color coding, the overlay markings. She couldn't read the specific details from this distance, but she could read the general shape of it. The map showed a valley, grid overlays, multiple marked positions in red, and in the center of the map, a cluster of marking that she recognized as artillery target plotting. She pushed the door open and went in. What happened in the next 90 seconds was not clean. The young operator at the radio set saw her first, and his reaction was trained. He reached for something under his workstation, a weapon or an alarm trigger. She didn't know which and couldn't afford to wait to find out. And she crossed the room in 4 steps and removed that option. The heavy-set man dropped his food container and came up out of his chair faster than she'd expected, and the chair went over backward and he was coming at her with something, and her leg screamed when she pivoted on it, and she used his momentum rather than fighting it, because she couldn't fight it with this leg. And the third man, the one who'd been studying the map, spun around and had his sidearm drawn. She had her own sidearm at his face before he completed the draw. The room went still. He was an officer. She could read the rank insignia even without knowing the specific designation. The quality of the uniform, the way he held himself, the way the other 2 operators were looking at him rather than at her. His pistol was still in his hand, not holstered, not raised. "Put it down," she said. Her voice came out level. She was surprised at how level it came out, given everything. He stared at her. "Now," she said. He looked at the 2 operators. He looked back at her. He looked at the muzzle of her SIG, which was 8 inches from his face and absolutely, completely steady, and he set his pistol on the workstation beside him. "Sit down," she said. "All three of you, on the floor." They sat. She looked at the map. Up close, the details resolved with a clarity that hit her somewhere below the sternum. The red-marked positions in the valley weren't random targets. They were arranged in a pattern she recognized from tactical planning overlays, a concentrated fire mission designed to saturate a specific grid with maximum ordnance and minimum time. The Allied command positions that she'd been briefed on as general locations were plotted here with a precision that suggested the targeting data was significantly more current and more specific than her command had known. Someone had been providing updates. She looked at the officer on the floor. "What's the fire mission schedule?" she asked. He said nothing. "I'm going to ask once more," she said, "and then I'm going to start reading these documents myself, which is going to take longer. And while I'm doing that, you're going to be lying on the floor in zip ties, and you're not going to enjoy any part of it." He looked at her for a long moment. He was calculating something. She could see it, the rapid assessment behind his eyes. And she recognized what he was calculating. He was deciding whether she was bluffing about the zip ties, whether she'd really leave him alive, whether there was any angle here that worked in his favor. "There are 200 soldiers in this compound," he said. His accent was heavy, but his English was precise. "You are one person, with a broken leg." "That's accurate," she said. "What's the fire mission schedule?" Something in his expression shifted. Not capitulation, something more complicated. The specific look of someone who has decided that their particular situation is worth explaining rather than fighting. 0400, he said. "The battery fires at 0400. She checked her watch. 2 hours and 17 minutes. She looked at the comms equipment. She looked at the map. She looked at the encoding equipment along the left wall and the radio encryption modules that she recognized from her training and the verification codes that were still on the main operator's workstation screen, still active from whatever transmission had most recently gone out. "You're going to help me transmit a message to Allied Command," she said. The officer on the floor looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. "Why," he said, "would I do that?" "Because," Riley said, "at 0400, when that battery opens up, your position is going to be the first thing Allied Command bombs. They know where you are. They don't know what you're planning because someone made sure the warning didn't get through, but they know where you are. So if that artillery fires, this compound stops existing before the second round is chambered." She let him sit with that. "You can help me stop it," she said, "or you can stay on the floor and take your chances with the counter-battery response." The officer on the floor looked at the map on the wall. He looked at the radio equipment. He looked at the two operators who were looking at the floor. He said, "What is the message?" Riley Hart pulled a notepad from her chest rig and started writing. Outside, the blizzard howled against the walls of Fort Black Hollow, and nobody inside the compound knew yet that they had a ghost in their communications center. But in the next 48 minutes, that was going to change. And so was everything else. The officer's name was Major Alexei Voss, and Riley knew this because his name was stenciled on the front flap of the field notebook sitting open on the workstation beside him. She didn't tell him she knew. She filed it away and kept her weapon on him and watched his hands. He wrote the message slowly, too slowly. She could see him thinking about each word in a way that suggested he was choosing them carefully, and not necessarily for the reasons she wanted. "Faster," she said. "I am being precise," he said, without looking up. "If the encoding sequence is wrong, the message will not authenticate on the other end. It will be discarded as enemy interference." She didn't respond to that. He was right, and they both knew it, and making a point of it would have been wasted breath. She watched his hands, and she watched the two operators on the floor, and she watched the door. The younger operator, the one who'd reached for something under the workstation, was watching her with the steady, controlled attention of someone who was not as frightened as he was pretending to be. She'd clocked that 2 minutes ago. His breathing was too regular. His hands were too still. He was waiting for something, or calculating something, and she moved one step to her right to change her angle on him and put a cabinet corner between her back and the door. "What's your name?" she asked him. He looked at the floor. "I'm not asking because I need it for anything official," she said. "I'm asking because I'd rather know what to call you than keep thinking of you as the one closest to the door." He looked up at that. Something shifted in his face. Not quite surprised, but close. "Dmitri," he said. Dmitri. She nodded. I need you to stay exactly where you are for the next 15 minutes. That's it. That's the whole ask. Can you do that? He didn't answer, but his shoulders dropped about a centimeter and he stopped watching the door, and she counted that as sufficient. Voss finished writing. He set the pen down and pushed the notepad toward her without standing up. She took it, read it without lowering her weapon, and felt a slow cold that had nothing to do with the weather move through her chest. The message was correct. The coordinates were accurate. The fire mission time was in it. The authentication header was properly formatted, but there was a sentence in the middle embedded in what should have been a standard grid reference notation that she almost missed. Almost. It was a flag, a signal embedded in the text that would tell anyone reading it on the other end that the message was sent under duress. Standard resistance to interrogation protocol. She'd been taught the same system in a different form during her own training. How to communicate that a transmission was compromised without alerting the person forcing you to transmit. She looked at Voss. He was watching her with the expression of a man who has played a card and is waiting to see if the other player knows the game. Rewrite it, she said. I don't know what you mean. The notation in grid line 3, she said. Rewrite it correctly. A pause. Very small. Then, I wrote it correctly. You wrote it as a duress signal, she said. Try again. Something moved across his face. It wasn't quite respect. It was something cooler than respect, more like recalibration. The adjustment a person makes when they realize the situation they're in is different from the situation they thought they were in. How do you know that format? He asked. Because I've been taught to read it, she said, just like you've been taught to write it. Rewrite the message. He took the notepad back. He rewrote the notation. She read it again, checked every grid reference against the map on the wall, checked the authentication codes against the active session on the operator's screen, and found it clean. She handed it to the younger operator. Transmit it, she said. Dmitri looked at Voss. Don't look at him, Riley said. Look at me. Transmit the message. Dmitri looked at the workstation. He looked at Voss one more time, a quick flick of the eyes that Voss answered with nothing. No expression, no signal, just a flat neutral face that told the younger man exactly nothing about what he should do, which Riley suspected was itself a kind of instruction. Dmitri transmitted the message. The confirmation tone came back 12 seconds later, a clean authentication response from Allied Command's relay station. The message had been received and logged. She heard the tone and felt something in her chest that wasn't quite relief, because relief assumed the hard part was over, and the hard part was nowhere close to over. She zip-tied Voss's wrist to the leg of the workstation he was sitting beside. She zip-tied the heavy-set operator, who had not said a single word since she'd entered the room, and whose silence she found more troubling than Dmitri's calculated calm, to the leg of a different station. She looked at Dmitri. I need you to keep monitoring this frequency, she said. If Allied Command sends a verification request, I need to know immediately. Can you do that? You're not going to tie me? He asked. I need your hands free, she said. Don't make me regret it. He turned to the workstation and put on the headset. Riley moved to the map on the wall and started memorizing it. The artillery battery was positioned on the north face of the compound, which she had not yet seen. Everything she knew about it came from the intelligence briefings, which had given her a general location and a rough equipment assessment. What the map on the wall told her was more specific. 3 gun positions arranged in a triangular pattern for mutual support, crew stations, a hardened ammunition point separate from the main armory, and a command post that sat between the guns and the main compound structure with line of sight to both. The fire mission schedule, 0400, Voss had said, and the map confirmed it with a timing notation in the margin. Gave her 1 hour and 51 minutes. She'd transmitted the warning. Allied Command had the fire mission time and the target coordinates. In theory, that was enough. In theory, the Allied positions would be alerted, defenses would be raised, and even if the battery fired, the damage would be reduced to something survivable. In theory. The problem with theory was that she'd been on the receiving end of enough combat planning to know how much gap could exist between what a warning said and what actually happened. Communications chains had friction. Nighttime alerts in established positions took time to move through the right channels. And the specific nature of this fire mission, saturating a grid with maximum ordnance and minimum time, was designed to cause casualties before any defensive response could be organized. The warning helped. It was not enough. She needed to get to the artillery. She looked at Voss. "The battery crew," she said. "What's their readiness status right now?" "I don't know, Say," he said. "You're the communications officer. You know everything that moves through this building. What's the status?" He looked at the ceiling. Not evasion, something else, almost a grimace. "Stand by," he said. "They moved to action stations at 0330, so they're in the crew quarters right now." "Presumably. How many?" 15, 20, perhaps? I don't have exact crew rosters." She looked at the map again. The battery command post was marked. The crew quarters were not, but she could infer their location from the general compound layout, close to the guns, sheltered, accessible from the interior. She traced the likely path from the comms building to the north face. "There's a road," she said, half to herself. "The vehicle track," Voss said, looking at the map despite himself. "It runs from the main vehicle pool to the gun positions." "How long does it take to traverse?" "By vehicle, 3 minutes. On foot, perhaps 10, in good conditions." She looked at the weather through the single narrow window in the east wall, visible because of the gap where the exterior paneling had warped in the cold. The blizzard had not diminished. If anything, in the last 40 minutes it had gotten worse. Not good conditions. She checked her watch. 1 hour, 44 minutes to 0400. "The ammunition point," she said. "Is it separate staff, or is it run by the battery crew?" "Battery crew manages their own ammunition point." "Is there a secondary detonator storage there?" Voss's face changed in a way that told her she'd asked the right question. "I don't know," he said, too carefully. "That's the second time you've said that about something you should know," she said. "You're good at your job, I can tell. People who are good at their jobs don't miss information about their own installation's weapons infrastructure." He said nothing. "There's a secondary storage at the ammunition point," she said. It wasn't a question. Still nothing. "Okay," she said. She picked up her rifle and moved toward the door. "You'll never reach it," Voss said behind her. "Not in this weather, not with your leg." She stopped at the door. "You came in through the east face," he said. "I heard you at the keypad. You got the door open in 4 tries. That's exceptional." He paused. "There are 42 personnel currently active in this compound, not counting the battery crew. Guards change rotation every 15 minutes. There are 3 fixed positions between this building and the north vehicle track." She turned around. He was watching her with an expression she still couldn't fully categorize. "Why are you telling me that?" she asked. "Because I want you to understand what you're walking into," he said. "And because the people planning this fire mission are not the people I work for." The room was quiet for a moment, except for the hiss of equipment and the howl of wind against the exterior walls. "Say that again," Riley said. "This compound's regular command structure did not originate this fire mission," he said. "The orders came through a lateral channel, a specific authorization code that bypasses the standard command hierarchy. I have been processing communications for 11 months in this posting. I know what the standard traffic looks like. This is not that." "Who authorized it?" "I don't know the originating identity. The code is real, properly formatted, correctly authenticated. But the routing is wrong. It doesn't trace back to our regional command. It traces back to a relay node that I cannot identify in our system." Riley stood in the doorway and looked at him and thought about what he was telling her and what it meant and what it connected to, the secondary frequency. The one on her team's issued list that shouldn't have been there, the lateral authorization that Voss was describing, the way Captain Mercer had avoided her eyes during the briefing. She thought about all of it and felt the pieces moving toward each other with the particular gravitational pull of things that were always going to connect, that had been connecting all along while she was too busy surviving to see the full picture. "You have intelligence on the relay node," she said. "I have logged traffic," he said, "which is not the same thing, but yes, there is a pattern." "Where is it stored?" "The secure partition on the primary server," he said, "which requires my authentication to access." She looked at him zip-tied to the workstation. "I would need my hands," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back at her with the steady, careful patience of someone who understood exactly how much trust he was asking for and was not trying to minimize it. She looked at Dmitri, who had his headset on and his attention on the radio equipment, and who was either genuinely monitoring the frequency or giving an excellent performance of doing so. She cut Voss's zip tie. He moved to the primary workstation without rushing, sat down, and accessed the server partition with a 12-character authentication sequence that he typed without hesitation. She watched his hands the entire time. He pulled up a file structure that meant nothing to her in its raw form, navigated 2 levels into it, and opened a log that was dense with alphanumeric traffic data. "Here," he said, and stepped back from the screen. She leaned in and read. The relay pattern was there. She could see it once she knew to look for it. A specific authentication header appearing on a recurring basis across multiple message logs, always routing from the same lateral node, always bypassing the standard chain. She couldn't identify the originating source from the data on screen, but she could photograph it. She didn't have a camera. She had a pen and the notepad from her chest rig, and she wrote down the header codes with the fast, compressed notation she'd used in every field log she'd ever maintained. It took 4 minutes. Her handwriting was not good. It never had been. But it was legible, which was all it needed to be. When she finished, she looked at Voss. "Why?" she asked. "Why what?" "Why give me this?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had shifted slightly. She could hear it in the change of pitch against the walls, a lower register that suggested it was coming from a different angle now, possibly the northeast. "Because the mission is wrong," he said finally. "The targets in that valley are not military positions." She went still. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I processed the targeting data 3 days ago, and I ran my own verification because the coordinates did not match any known military installation in that grid." He paused. "The targets are supply depots, medical stations, a forward aid station, non-combatant infrastructure." The cold that had moved through her chest earlier came back. Different this time. More specific. "That's not what the intelligence brief said," she said. "No," he said. "It would not be." She straightened up from the workstation. She looked at the map on the wall. She looked at the grid markings she'd been reading as Allied command positions, and she recalculated them with the new information, and the geometry of it shifted in a way that made her stomach tighten. Medical stations. Supply depots. The kind of targets that didn't generate military advantage. The kind of targets that generated something else entirely. "How many people?" she said. "At the aid station alone?" He hesitated. The traffic indicated patient capacity of approximately 300. Current occupancy? "I don't know." She picked up her rifle. "Voss," she said. "Yes." "The secondary detonator storage at the ammunition point. Tell me where it is." He told her. The path from the comms building to the north vehicle track was worse than the map had suggested, not because the distance was wrong, but because the terrain between the structures was a series of gaps and angles that exposed her to sightlines from multiple guard posts simultaneously. She moved through it the way she moved through everything tonight, slowly, with full attention to every sound and shift in the wind, using the buildings themselves as cover and the blizzard as concealment. Her leg had stopped sending her useful information. That was not good. Pain had been a signal. The absence of pain, at this temperature, after this amount of time on a compromised limb, meant one of 2 things. The cold was blocking the nerve signals, or the tissue was past the point of acute response. She couldn't stop to evaluate it. She kept pressure on the right side and kept moving. The first fixed guard position between the comms building and the vehicle track was exactly where Voss had said it would be. At the junction of 2 internal compound roads, a guardhouse barely larger than a phone booth, built from corrugated metal sheeting and housing one person who was visible as a shape behind a scratched plexiglass window. One person, inside looking out. She went around the back of the adjacent building, added 40 meters to her route, and came at the junction from the opposite angle. The guard never looked her direction. The second position was in the open, no avoiding it. It sat at the entrance to the vehicle track, a proper post with a barrier arm and 2 guards, and there was no architectural cover between her current position and the track entrance, just 30 meters of open, lamp-lit compound surface. She lay in the shadow of the nearest building and looked at the 2 guards and thought. They were talking. One of them was doing most of it. She could see the slight movement of his face, the gestures that people made when they were telling something, a story or a complaint or a joke. The other one was listening, his attention on the speaker rather than the compound. The lamp at the post was behind them, which meant they were looking from light into relative darkness when they looked outward. She moved. She went flat to the ground and moved on her right elbow and her knees across the 30 meters in what was probably the worst 3 minutes of a night that had not been short on bad minutes. Her left leg dragged because bending it against the splint produced a resistance that she had to consciously force through. And somewhere around the 20-meter mark, she put her right knee down on a piece of ice that shifted under her and made a sound, a soft crack, that made her freeze absolutely still with her face in the snow and her entire body waiting. The two guards kept talking. She made it to the shadow on the far side of the vehicle track barrier and stayed low and moved north along the track toward the gun positions. The wind was directly in her face now, which was miserable in every physical sense and useful in every tactical one. If the wind was in her face, it was behind anyone she was approaching. She kept her head down and moved. The gun positions came into view at the end of the track. 3 emplacements in the triangular arrangement the map had shown, each one a concrete pad with a hooded shelter structure over it. The guns themselves were massive, long-barreled pieces under weatherproof covers. Between 2 of the emplacements, a hardened structure that was almost certainly the ammunition point, and at each emplacement, a guard. 3 guards, 1 per position. She stopped in the shadow of the last building on the vehicle track and did a count. 3 guards, 2 to 1 hour and 23 minutes before action stations. The battery crew was somewhere in the compound interior, sleeping or resting, and they would emerge at 0330 and begin the work of preparing the guns for a fire mission that would kill people in a medical aid station 40 kilometers southwest. She pulled the notepad from her chest rig and looked at the location Voss had described for the secondary detonator storage. It was inside the ammunition point. Of course it was. She thought about Voss in the comms building, zip-tied again now. She'd re-secured him before she left, even after everything, because she wasn't operating on trust, she was operating on situational alignment, and those were different things. She thought about the message she'd transmitted and the authentication tone that had come back, and the terrible math of what happened if the warning alone wasn't sufficient. She thought about the aid station, 300 patients. She moved toward the ammunition point. The third guard position, the one between her and the ammunition point, was a problem she didn't have a clean solution for. The guard was moving, not in a fixed pattern, but in the way of someone who was cold and bored and combating both by walking in slow circles around the area between the 3 emplacements. He was armed with a long gun, wearing full cold weather kit, and his movement pattern was irregular enough that she couldn't reliably predict where he'd be in 90 seconds. She watched him for 4 minutes. His circles were loose and his attention was inward, not threat-focused, but environment-focused, the look of someone monitoring their own discomfort rather than their surroundings. He stopped once at the edge of the nearest emplacement and stood with his back to her, and she moved during that stop, cutting the distance in half, reaching the wall of the ammunition point while his back was still turned. The ammunition point door was a metal hatch, hinged, with a drop bar lock rather than a padlock. She lifted the bar as slowly as she had ever lifted anything, holding the hatch against its frame to prevent the creak of cold hinges, and eased it open 1 centimeter at a time until there was enough gap to move through. Inside was dark and smelled of propellant and cold metal. She used the penlight. The secondary detonator storage was exactly where Voss had said, a locked box on the right wall, key-locked, which she opened in 40 seconds with the pick set. Inside, fuse assemblies for the artillery rounds, not the fuses currently installed on the ready ammunition in the main armory. Those were already gone. She'd dealt with that. These were the backup stock, the contingency supply. Without these, even if the armory charges she'd planted failed or were discovered and disabled, the battery would have no way to fuse their ammunition. You could load an artillery round into a gun and fire it, and all you'd get was a very expensive and very loud nothing. She worked through the fuse assemblies methodically, removing the critical primer components from each one and pocketing them. It took 9 minutes. Her fingers had gone from numb to something past numb, a deep ache that slowed her fine motor work and made the small components difficult to handle, and she dropped 2 of the primer caps and had to find them on the floor in the dark with her penlight, moving her hand slowly across the cold concrete until she felt them. When she was done, she closed the box and locked it, and eased back out through the hatch. The roving guard was not where she expected him to be. He was 6 meters away, facing her direction. She had the hatch half closed, and she went still, and the guard stood there in the blowing snow and the dark and looked in her direction with the particular unfocused attention of someone who has heard or seen something but hasn't yet decided if it was real. She was below his direct line of sight. She'd come out lower than she'd gone in because of how she'd moved through the hatch, and the storm was between them in every practical sense. Her gear was white-gray. Her face was covered. He stared for about 15 seconds. Then he turned and continued his circuit. She let the hatch drop the last centimeter and held the bar in place and breathed. On the way back through the compound, she was thinking about Voss's information, the relay node, the traffic log she'd transcribed, the lateral authorization channel that bypassed the standard command hierarchy. And she was thinking about the secondary frequency on her team's issued comms list, and the calculation that had been building at the back of her mind all night reached a point where she had to look at it directly. Someone with access to the pre-mission communications package had seeded the wrong frequency into her team's equipment. That was not an accident. That was access. Specific, deliberate access to classified mission materials at the source. Captain Mercer had issued the communications package. She thought about that. She thought about what Voss had said about the routing on the lateral authorization. She thought about the abandoned mission, the 9 words, the absence of a sweep to confirm whether she was alive. She was thinking about it so hard that she almost missed the change. The compound had gotten louder, not dramatically louder, not alarm louder, but the ambient noise of the place had shifted in a way she registered before she consciously identified the cause, and she stopped walking and pressed herself to the nearest wall and listened. Voices. More than before, and coming from multiple directions. The sound of a door opening somewhere on the south face of the compound. Boots on packed snow. She checked her watch. 0321, 9 minutes early. The battery crew was going to action stations 9 minutes early, and she was standing in the middle of the compound with 42 active personnel and 3 guard positions between her and anywhere useful. And then the alarm went off. Not a full compound alert, not the klaxon-level response she'd feared when she'd gone through the armory. Something smaller. A localized signal, single tone, coming from the direction of the comms building. Voss, or the heavyset operator, had gotten loose. Or Dmitri had made a different choice than she'd given him credit for. Lights came on across the compound. More doors. Shouting, now, in multiple directions. Flashlight beams cutting across the open center of the compound in a way that made the open ground completely impassable. Riley pressed herself into the gap between 2 buildings and ran a fast inventory of her situation. She was in the middle of a compound with 40-plus personnel going to alert. She had less than 31 rifle rounds and 2 pistol magazines. She had a leg that was operating well past its tolerance. She had no extraction, and in 39 minutes, a battery crew was going to reach their guns and attempt to fire a mission that targeted a medical aid station. She'd disabled the fuse supply. She'd damaged the primary detonator storage. She'd transmitted the warning. It might be enough. She didn't believe it was enough. She needed something else. One more thing, one lever that would guarantee the mission didn't fire even if everything she'd done so far was discovered and partially reversed. Something that couldn't be quietly undone in 39 minutes. She thought about the gun positions themselves, the mechanisms that controlled elevation and traverse, the specific points in the breech assembly that, if compromised, would render the gun inoperable without a repair team. She'd been trained on artillery sabotage in a course that she'd mostly slept through because it had been a low-probability add-on to her standard curriculum, and she was now regretting every minute of that sleep with an intensity she reserved for very specific kinds of mistakes. She remembered enough. Maybe enough. She had 39 minutes, a compound going to alert around her, and she was about to move back toward the gun emplacements. The flashlight beams swept back and forth across the compound center, and somewhere behind her she heard a shout that had the specific quality of someone who has found something they weren't supposed to find, and she thought it was probably the armory. She moved north, back toward the guns, into the dark and the howling wind, and she did not let herself think about the math of what she was doing versus what she had left to do it with. She'd stopped doing that kind of math a long time ago. It never helped. The first gun emplacement was 30 meters ahead, and the compound was waking up behind her. She didn't run. Running on this leg, in this dark, across ground she hadn't walked before, would put her face down in the snow inside of 10 seconds. She moved at the fastest pace she could sustain, a controlled, uneven stride that ate distance without sacrificing the stability she needed to stay upright. And she counted the flashlight beams behind her and tracked their movement the way she tracked everything, as data points rather than threats. Because threats required emotional processing, and she didn't have bandwidth for that right now. 4 beams. Moving in a sweep pattern from the armory toward the compound interior, someone had found the detonator subroom. She had maybe 4 minutes before the sweep reached the north face. The roving guard between the emplacements was no longer roving. He was standing at the entrance to the vehicle track, facing south, watching the lights. His back was to the gun positions. His rifle was in his hands but not raised. He had the posture of someone who was aware something was happening and was waiting for it to resolve into something he understood. She went around him on the west side, into the gap between the first and second emplacements, and got herself behind the concrete wall of the first gun position. The gun was a 152mm howitzer. She knew the type from the barrel profile and the breech housing even under the weatherproof cover. She'd seen them in recognition training and in more recent and less theoretical contexts. The breech mechanism was on the right side. The key point, the thing she'd half absorbed in that artillery sabotage course between one nap and another, was the obturator assembly, the component that sealed the breech against propellant gases. If the obturator was compromised, the gun would not fire safely, and any experienced crew chief would refuse to operate it. She pulled the cover back from the breech. The cold hit the metal with a particular quality, a faint tick of thermal contraction, barely audible, that she felt more than heard. She worked fast with her right hand, her left bracing against the breech housing because her left arm was functioning as structural support rather than as a working limb at this point, and she found the obturator assembly with her fingers and did what she needed to do to it with the handle of her knife. It was not a clean fix. It was a damage job, the kind that would be obvious to a crew chief who knew what he was looking at. That was the point. She needed the crew to stop, assess, and argue about it, and that process would cost time. She moved to the second emplacement. Behind her, the sweep lights had reached the north face. She heard shouting, organized, directional shouting, the kind that meant someone was coordinating a search rather than reacting to an immediate contact. They'd found the armory damage. They hadn't found her yet. She could tell the difference from the quality of the noise. The second gun took her 3 minutes because the weatherproof cover was lashed down more securely than the first, and she had to cut 2 of the tie-downs with her knife before she could access the breech. Her hands were past the point where fine motor work was reliable. She was operating on muscle memory and anger. And the anger was useful because it kept her moving when the cold in the leg and the accumulated damage of the night were all arguing for her to stop. She damaged the second obturator. 1 gun left. The third emplacement was the farthest north, closest to the perimeter wire on the compound's north face, and getting to it meant crossing 20 meters of open ground between the second and third positions. She looked at the 20 meters and looked at the sweep lights, which were now close enough that she could hear the voices of the soldiers carrying them. And she went. She was halfway across when a light caught her. Not centered on her, a peripheral sweep that tracked across her direction of movement rather than straight at her, a beam that touched her left side for approximately 1 second before moving on. She froze. The beam moved. She heard a voice say something in a volume that suggested it was directed inward, toward the other searchers, not outward at a target. She reached the third emplacement. Her hands were shaking as she pulled the cover. Not from cold specifically. The shaking had a different quality, a fine tremor that she recognized as the combined result of sustained physical stress, caloric deficit, and the particular kind of mental load that came from operating alone in a high-stakes environment for an extended period. She let the tremor happen and worked through it. She was 3/4 through the obturator on the third gun when the voice came from directly behind her. "Don't move." She didn't move. The voice was young, tighter than young, say, strung, the way voices got when the person behind them was scared and trying not to sound scared. She registered that without turning her hand. Her hand was still on the breech assembly. Her knife was in her right hand. Her rifle was slung. "Hands where I can see them." She brought her hands up slowly. The knife was visible. She heard the sharp intake of breath that meant he'd seen it. "Drop it." She dropped it. It hit the concrete of the emplacement pad with a sound that was very loud in the relative quiet between the wind gusts. "Turn around, slowly." She turned around. The guard was young, early 20s, she thought, though the cold weather kit and the tension in his face made it difficult to be certain. He had a rifle leveled at her, and he was doing the right things. Distance maintained, two-handed grip, weapon not quite at chest height, because at chest height you couldn't see the target's hands. He'd been trained. Not elite training, but real training. He looked at her leg, at the improvised splint, at the state of her gear, which told a story of the last several hours that she wouldn't have believed herself if she hadn't lived it. "Who are you?" he said. She said nothing. "How many of you are there?" She said nothing. He keyed something on his shoulder. A radio. She heard the click transmit before the squelch cut it, and spoke quickly. A burst of reporting that she could partially follow. "Contact at gun position 3. One person. Single." A response came back. She caught the tone more than the words. Acknowledgement, instructions, and underneath it the particular urgency of a command element that was responding to multiple simultaneous problems. The guard looked at her. He was processing something. She could see it moving across his face, the calculation of what to do with her, whether to hold this position or move her back to the interior, whether what she'd been doing to the gun behind her was as bad as it looked. "What did you do to the gun?" he asked. "Nothing that matters," she said. "That's not an answer." "No," she said, "it's not." He stared at her. His rifle had drifted about 3 degrees to the right. Not enough to matter if he pulled the trigger, but enough to register as a loss of absolute focus. He was young and he was cold, and the situation was more complicated than anything in his training had prepared him for. "Get on your knees," he said. She looked at her left leg. "I can't," she said. He blinked. "My leg," she said. "I genuinely cannot put that joint into a kneeling position right now. If you need me on the ground, I can go flat on my front, but kneeling isn't something this leg does anymore tonight." He stared at her for a moment longer. Then he took a step toward her, and she didn't move, and he grabbed her left arm and turned her toward the compound interior, and she went. Because the gun was done enough, and because there was nothing more she could do in the next 32 minutes, from a position outside the compound that she couldn't potentially do from a position inside it. She walked, and he kept the rifle at her back, and behind them the howitzer sat with its obturator quietly compromised in the dark. They brought her to the main building. It was warmer inside than anywhere else she'd been in the compound. Not warm by any absolute standard, but the absence of wind made it feel dramatically different, and her body registered the change with a bone-deep, involuntary relief that she actively resented. She needed to stay sharp. Warmth was an argument against sharp. The room they put her in was a briefing space. Long table, chairs, a map board on the far wall that was different from the one in the comms building. Tactical rather than operational, focused on the immediate surrounding terrain. She sat in a chair because standing had stopped being an option she could maintain without an obvious tremor, and she watched the door and waited. 3 soldiers remained in the room with her. 2 stood near the door. The third, a sergeant, from his bearing and the deference the other 2 showed him, stood beside the table and watched her with an expression that contained more professional interest than personal hostility. "You came in through the ravine," he said. It wasn't a question. "Approximately," she said. "Alone?" "Yes." He looked at her leg, at the splint. The blood that had soaked through from where the impact had opened something that the cold had mostly slowed but not fully stopped. At the state of her hands, which even she couldn't look at directly right now. "You've been operating in this compound for how long?" he said. "Long enough." "What did you do to the armory?" "Reduced your fuse supply." "And the ammunition point?" "Also reduced." "And the guns?" She looked at him. "The guns," he said again. "You should have your crew chief look at them before you try to fire anything," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The 2 guards by the door were very still. "Who sent you?" he said. "Nobody sent me," she said. "I sent myself." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't read cleanly. It was somewhere between disbelief and something more considered than disbelief. "1 soldier," he said. "Alone. In this weather. With a broken leg. It's been a complicated night," she said. The door opened. The man who came in was not a man she had seen before, but she knew the type immediately. The way you knew a type from 100 briefings and a dozen operational environments, from every room where decisions got made at a level that insulated itself from consequences. He was in his 50s, compact, with the kind of physical fitness that was maintained as a professional statement rather than a personal one. His uniform bore no insignia she could identify with certainty, which was itself a kind of insignia. He looked at Riley with the specific expression of someone who is reassessing a calculation they believed they had already completed. "Sergeant Hart," he said. She felt something tighten in her chest. "You know who I am," she said. "I know who you are." He pulled out a chair across the table from her and sat down with the unhurried ease of a man at a briefing he is running rather than attending. "I've known who you are since approximately midnight, when the perimeter guard failed to report on rotation." "Then you knew for 2 hours and decided not to do anything about it," she said. "We had other things to manage," he said. "The weather complicated rapid response. And frankly, Sergeant, the assessment was that you were a single injured soldier who had already transmitted a warning to Allied Command, which we knew about, by the way, before the ink was dry, and whose capacity to cause meaningful operational disruption was limited. And now? And now I'm revising that assessment," he said. He said it without embarrassment. It was a factual statement, not a concession. "What did you do to the guns?" "Same thing I told your sergeant," she said. "Have someone look at them before you fire." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the sergeant near the table and made a small motion with his hand. The sergeant left. One guard remained by the door. "You're not going to ask me who I am," he said. "I don't need to," she said. "You're the lateral channel." The room was quiet. "I'm the authorization that bypassed the regional command hierarchy," she said. "The routing that your communications officer couldn't trace back to a standard chain. That's you, or that's your people, and you're here in person, which suggests the latter." He looked at her with a new quality of attention. "Voss told you that," he said. "Voss gave me the traffic logs," she said. "I read them myself. Voss is doing his job," she said, "which is process communications and notice when something is wrong with the chain. You should have accounted for that." The man across the table was quiet for a moment. Outside, she could hear activity. The compound continuing to respond to multiple simultaneous problems, the sound of vehicles starting, boots on packed snow. She checked her watch without making it obvious and caught a glimpse of the face. 0347. 13 minutes. "The fire mission," she said. "Call it off." "The fire mission has been significantly compromised by your activities tonight," he said. "The fuse supply, the backup fuse supply, and apparently something wrong with at least one of the guns. Operationally, it's a more complicated situation than it was 3 hours ago." "That's not the same as calling it off." "No," he said. "It isn't." She looked at him across the table. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who is used to being the most patient person in a room and has decided to demonstrate that. "You're going to use this conversation to run out the clock," she said. "I'm going to have a conversation," he said. "What happens at the end of it depends on several things." "The aid station," she said. Something moved in his face. Very slight. The kind of movement that people made when they'd convinced themselves they didn't feel something about a thing, and then the thing was named out loud. "There are 300 patients in that aid station," she said. "Non-combatants, medical personnel, people in post-surgical recovery who cannot move under their own power. You know this because your targeting data is specific enough that Voss noticed the coordinates didn't match any military installation in that grid. You know exactly what you're targeting." "Strategic infrastructure," he said. "It's a hospital," she said. "Supply chains, logistics networks, medical capacity that supports sustained offensive operations. The targeting is..." "It's a hospital," she said again. He stopped. The guard by the door was looking at the floor. "Sergeant Hart," the man said. His voice had shifted slightly, not softer, more careful. "What you've managed to accomplish tonight is, objectively, remarkable. I don't say that to flatter you. I say it because it's accurate and because I want you to understand that I recognize it. You came through a ravine, alone, with a broken leg, and you've managed to put this operation in a position it wasn't in 3 hours ago." He folded his hands on the table. "But you're one person, in a room. And this conversation ends when I decide it ends." Riley looked at him. She looked at the guard by the door. She looked at her watch. "You authorized this mission through a back channel," she said, "because you knew the standard command chain would reject it. You knew what those coordinates were. You knew what would happen to the people in that aid station, and you did it anyway. And then you made sure the warning my team was supposed to deliver never reached Allied command. She paused. Captain Mercer. He works for you. The man's face didn't change, but his hands on the table did, an infinitesimal tightening, a stillness that was too deliberate to be natural. That's a significant claim, he said. The secondary frequency, she said, the one seeded into our pre-mission comms package. It's not a routing frequency. It's a monitoring frequency. You were listening to my team's internal communications the entire time. You knew exactly when we were in position. You knew when Mercer called the withdrawal. You heard everything. The guard by the door had stopped looking at the floor. And then when I went into the ravine, she said, you thought that was the last of it. One soldier down. Mercer withdraws the team. The warning never transmits. The mission fires at 0400. And somewhere in the command post-mortem, Sergeant Riley Hart is listed as killed in action during a reconnaissance mission that never officially involved Fort Black Hollow. The man across the table looked at her for a long time. You're very good, he said, and the way he said it was not a compliment. I know, she said. He stood up. I'm going to need to make some calls, he said to the guard. Keep her here. The mission, she said. He stopped at the door. Call it off, she said. He didn't answer. He opened the door, and he left, and the guard by the door moved to stand between her and the exit with his rifle across his chest and his face carefully blank. Riley sat in the chair and looked at the map board on the wall and thought about 13 minutes. 12 now. The guard's name was written on a piece of tape on his collar. A field modification, the kind of informal unit identifier that troops in forward positions sometimes adopted when regular insignia became a liability. The name on the tape was Cole, and Cole was watching her with the expression of someone who had been in the room for everything that just happened and was still processing it. She didn't say anything to Cole for a while. Then she said, How long have you been at this posting? He didn't answer. I'm not asking for intel, she said. I'm just talking. He looked at the wall above her head. The people who run the mission you're supporting, she said, do they know your name? Not the tape. Your actual name. Cole said nothing. The man who just left this room, she said. He didn't look at you once. Not when he came in, not when he was talking, not when he left. You were furniture. She paused. That's not a criticism of you. That's a description of him. Cole shifted his weight from his right foot to his left. 300 people, she said. In the aid station. Stop talking, he said. The crew chiefs are at the guns right now, she said, and they're finding problems. Which means the fire mission is delayed, and every minute it's delayed is a minute Allied command has to respond to the warning I transmitted. You know what happens when Allied command gets a verified warning with a specific fire mission time and a specific coordinate set? Cole looked at her. They don't just alert the positions, she said. They run counter-battery targeting. They put strike aircraft on standby. They push rapid response assets toward the threat vector. All of that is happening right now, 40 kilometers from here. And it accelerates the moment the battery fires, or the moment they get a second transmission confirming the mission is active. She watched Cole's face. There is no version of tonight, she said, where this ends well for anyone in this compound. Not because of me, because of the man who designed this mission and didn't tell any of you what was actually on the other end of those coordinates. I said, stop talking. Cole, she said. He looked at her directly. What city are you from? She asked. It was such an unexpected question that he answered before he decided to. Kessler, he said. I don't know it, she said. Is it worth going back to? The question sat in the room. His jaw tightened, he looked away. But something in his posture changed, a fraction, barely enough to measure, but she'd been reading bodies in high-stress environments for long enough to know what she was looking at. He was thinking about home. She looked at her watch. 8 minutes. The door opened. It was not the man in the unmarked uniform. It was the sergeant who had been in the room earlier, the one who had left when the man sent him to check the guns. He came back in fast, with the specific quality of movement that meant the news was bad from someone's perspective, and he crossed to Cole and spoke in a low voice that Riley caught maybe a quarter of. She caught enough. Both guns were inoperable. The third was under assessment. The crew chief had refused to authorize the fire mission pending inspection of all 3 pieces. Cole looked at her over the sergeant's shoulder. She held his eyes. The sergeant turned and looked at her too, with an expression she recognized. Not anger exactly, but the specific frustration of someone who had underestimated a problem and was now standing in the consequences of that underestimation. "What did you do to them?" he said. "The same thing you'd do to them," she said, "if you knew what those coordinates pointed to." "That's not your call," he said. "Somebody had to make it," she said. He stared at her. She could see him calculating, reassessing, running through the same math she'd been running all night from a different angle. "The fire mission can be reconstructed," he said, more to himself than to her. "New fuses from the main armory were also addressed," she said. He looked at her. "The detonator sub-room in the main armory," she said. "The fuse primers have been removed. The components are in my jacket pockets. The backup supply at the ammunition point was also addressed. You have artillery that can't fire and no way to fix that in," she checked her watch. 6 minutes. The sergeant's face had gone very still. From outside, she heard something new. It was faint at first, a low, growing register that she felt in her chest before she consciously identified it. She'd heard that sound in other contexts, other places, and her body recognized it before her mind caught up. Aircraft. Multiple aircraft from the sound of it, and they were not coming from the south where Fort Black Hollow's own air assets were based. They were coming from the southwest, from the direction of Allied command positions 40 kilometers away. Cole heard it too. She saw it cross his face. The sound registered, identified, and the identification landed with its full weight in the space of maybe 2 seconds. The sergeant crossed to the door in 4 steps and pulled it open, and the sound came in much louder, unfiltered. The deep, resonant pulse of ground attack aircraft on a strike approach. From somewhere in the compound, someone started shouting. The sergeant spun to face her. "How long have they been inbound?" he demanded. "I don't know," she said honestly. But Allied command doesn't wait around when they have specific targeting data for an active threat. "We need to transmit the stand down. You need to do it right now," she said. "Not the man who just left this room. Your command chain, your actual command chain. Direct to Allied command, authenticated, with the correct stand-down codes, and you need to do it in about the next 3 minutes before those aircraft hit their release point." The sergeant looked at Cole. Cole looked at the sergeant. "The comms building," Riley said. "Voss is still in there. He's zip-tied to a workstation, but he can authenticate. He knows the stand-down protocol. Get him on the radio." "And why," the sergeant said, "would Allied command accept a stand-down from this installation?" "They won't," she said. "Not from this installation, but they'll accept one from me." She reached into her chest rig and pulled out the emergency authentication token. A small, hardened card, military issue, tied to her personal authentication codes in the Allied command system. The kind of thing that was registered to a specific operator and that could verify the identity of the person transmitting. She'd had it all night. She held it up. "Get me to the comms building." The sergeant stared at the card. The sound of the aircraft was getting louder. "Now," she said. "We are out of time." She wasn't sure later what tipped the sergeant. It might have been the aircraft sound. It might have been the accumulation of the night, the armory, the ammunition point, the guns, the progressive demonstration that she knew what she was talking about in every specific she'd named. It might have been something simpler, the specific kind of decision that gets made when the only option that has any chance of working is also the option that requires trusting the person you've been holding at gunpoint for the last 10 minutes. He grabbed her arm and they moved. Through the main building at a pace that her leg made ugly, but not impossible. Through the exterior door into the blizzard, which hit her like a physical argument. Across the compound, which was now a landscape of running soldiers and shouted orders and vehicles that were starting up without clear direction because the alert had exceeded the compound's response planning and people were reverting to individual action rather than coordinated response. Nobody stopped them. She thought that was partly the sergeant's authority and partly the fact that the compound was in enough chaos that 2 people moving with purpose read as belonging to the chaos rather than moving against it. The comms building, the east face. She punched the code, the same 4 worn digits still good, and they went in. Voss was where she'd left him. Zip-tied upright in his chair, with the expression of a man who has been waiting to find out how things resolved and is only now getting the first data point. He looked at her, then at the sergeant, then back at her. "Aircraft inbound," she said. "I hear them," he said. She cut his zip tie. He moved to the primary workstation without being told, pulled up the frequency, and began entering the authentication sequence. She stood beside him with her authentication token and her radio, and she pulled up the Allied Command emergency frequency on the handset she'd had all night and keyed the transmit. "Allied Command, this is Sergeant Riley Hart. Special Operations, Authentication Delta 7, Tango 9 or 4. Transmitting stand-down request for airstrike on grid, November, Foxtrot 774. Fire mission at this grid has been neutralized. Stand down, stand down, stand down." She released the transmit. Static. 3 seconds. 5. Then a voice came back, clipped, professional, with the compressed vowels of someone reading from a protocol sheet. "Authentication confirmed, Sergeant Hart. State operational status." "Fire mission neutralized," she said. "Artillery inoperable. No active threat to Allied positions. Requesting abort of airstrike." A longer pause. The aircraft sound outside had changed. She couldn't tell from inside the building whether it was getting louder or whether the pitch shift meant something else. An altitude change. A target acquisition cycle beginning. "Sergeant Hart, stand by." She stood by. Voss was watching her. The sergeant was watching her. Cole, who had followed them without being asked, was standing in the doorway watching her with his rifle held loose at his side. The voice came back. "Sergeant Hart, airstrike on November Foxtrot 774 is on hold pending verification. Hold your position. Confirm your status." "I'm in one piece," she said. "Mostly." A pause. "Copy that, Sergeant. Hold position. We have aircraft on station. Stand by for verification." She set the handset down on the workstation. The room was quiet except for the equipment hiss and the wind outside and the sound of her own breathing, which she was only now noticing was not as steady as she'd like it to be. She put both hands on the edge of the workstation and let the weight go through her arms for a moment and felt her left leg, which had stopped sending any reliable signals whatsoever at some point in the last 20 minutes. Voss looked at the sergeant. The sergeant looked at Riley. "The man who came to the briefing room," she said to the sergeant. "The one in the unmarked uniform. Where is he?" The sergeant's expression told her before he spoke. "He left," he said. "About 10 minutes ago. Before the aircraft sound." She closed her eyes for a moment. Of course he had. Men like that always knew when to leave. They read the situation a move ahead, and they were already at the vehicle and through the perimeter before anyone had organized enough to block the exit. He had the extracted data on the relay node. He had whatever operational security his position had given him. And he had Captain Mercer somewhere out there in the blizzard. And whatever chain of back-channel authorizations had made tonight possible, and none of that was going to be resolved in this room. Not tonight. "Voss," she said. "Yes." "The traffic logs from the secure partition. Is there a way to transmit them as a package to Allied Command?" "It would take time to package correctly," he said. "How much time?" 20 minutes. Perhaps 30. She looked at the handset on the workstation. "Hold position," the voice had said. "We have aircraft on station. They weren't going anywhere." "Do it," she said. He turned to the workstation and started working. She watched Cole in the doorway. Cole was looking at the floor again, but differently than before. The way a person looked at the floor when they were thinking about something, not avoiding something. Outside, the aircraft sound had stabilized. Still there, holding. The compound outside had gone strangely quiet. The running and shouting had settled into something more uncertain, the ambient noise of a large group of people who have been in crisis mode and have run out of immediate crisis to respond to and don't yet know what comes next. She reached into her jacket pockets and felt the fuse primers she'd taken from the ammunition point. Small cylinders, cold metal, sitting in her palm like the most mundane objects in the world. She set them on the workstation beside Voss. He glanced at them, then at her. Then he went back to packaging the traffic logs. "Sergeant," she said to the sergeant behind her. "What?" "The man in the unmarked uniform," she said. "When he left, did he take anything with him? Documents, a drive, anything from this building?" "I don't know," he said. "I wasn't with him." "Who was?" A pause. He was thinking about whether to answer. "Corvich," he said finally. "One of his own people, not compound personnel." "Corvich left with him?" "Yes." She filed that and looked at the map on the wall. The tactical one, the terrain map of the immediate area. The compound had one vehicle access road. In a blizzard, at this hour, the options for rapid departure were limited. The man in the unmarked uniform was either still on the mountain or he'd had a vehicle staged somewhere she hadn't identified, which was possible, which was the kind of operational detail that a man of his type planned for. She thought about what Voss had said about the lateral authorization, the relay node she'd transcribed from the logs, the traffic pattern that connected this compound to something else, somewhere else, through a channel that bypassed every standard oversight mechanism in the command structure. Mercer was out there. The man in the unmarked uniform was out there. The chain was still intact, and tonight had been one operation in what was almost certainly a larger pattern. She had neutralized one fire mission. She had incomplete data on a network. The handset crackled. Sergeant Hart, this is Colonel Draymond, Allied Command Forward. Authentication of your transmission verified. We're holding the strike. I need a full status report. She picked up the handset. Colonel, she said, I have a lot to tell you. I have time, the colonel said. Start from the beginning. She pulled the notepad from her chest rig, the one with the relay node header codes, the traffic log transcriptions, the specific authentication patterns that Voss had showed her from the secure partition, and she set it on the workstation in front of her. The beginning is going to take a while, she said. Sergeant Hart, the colonel said. You just talked us off a live strike from inside a hostile compound with a broken leg and no extraction. I think we have time. She looked at the notepad. She looked at Voss, who was still working at the adjacent station, his fingers moving efficiently across the keyboard with the focused calm of a man who had decided what he was doing and why. She looked at Cole in the doorway, who was still there, still with his rifle loose at his side, standing in the middle of a compound that had been his assignment and was now something else entirely. Outside, the aircraft held position in the dark. The blizzard was still going. She began. She talked for 41 minutes. Colonel Draymond didn't interrupt much. He asked 2 clarifying questions about the relay node header codes and one about the authentication pattern she'd transcribed from Voss's logs. And the rest of the time, he listened with the specific quality of attention that experienced command personnel used when they were simultaneously processing information and making decisions about what to do with it. Riley had briefed enough senior officers to recognize the difference between someone listening to understand and someone listening to respond, and Draymond was doing the former. When she finished, there was a pause on the line. Sergeant Hart, he said, I need to ask you something directly. Sir? Captain Mercer, you're certain about the comms package. The secondary frequency was seeded into the pre-mission package that Mercer issued, she said. Whether he built it himself or received it from someone else and passed it along, I can't tell you with certainty. What I can tell you is that the frequency corresponds to the monitoring channel in the traffic logs from this installation, and that Mercer was the last person with unrestricted access to the package before we deployed. Another pause. Where is Mercer now? I don't know, she said. He withdrew the team approximately 4 hours ago. Last known position, the ridgeline above Black Ridge Pass. And the man you described, the unmarked uniform, left the compound approximately 30 minutes ago. One companion, named Korvich, vehicle access road on the east face. She hesitated. He had a head start, and he knew he was taking it. He planned the exit before things went wrong for him here. We'll address that, Draymond said, in a tone that contained a great deal more than those 3 words. Colonel, she said, the aid station, the one on the target list. We've already been in contact. They're on elevated alert, no casualties. A pause. Thanks to you. She sat with that for a moment. The relief that moved through her was not triumphant. It was the specific kind of exhausted relief that came when something catastrophic had been prevented at a cost that you hadn't finished calculating yet. Sir, she said, I need extraction. It's already moving, he said. We have a bird inbound to your position. ETA, 40 minutes, weather depending, medical team on board. He paused. Can you hold another 40 minutes? She looked at her leg. Yes, she said. Good. Stay on this frequency. Draymond out. The handset went quiet. She set it down and put both palms flat on the workstation and breathed. Voss looked at her from the adjacent station. He had finished transmitting the traffic log package and had been sitting quietly for the last several minutes, which she had registered and appreciated without commenting on. The aircraft are leaving, he said. She could hear it, the engine note changing register, the shift in pitch that meant altitude gain and departure vector. The compound was very quiet without it. Yes, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what happens to us? She looked at him. Allied command personnel will be at this compound within the hour, she said. After that, it's above my pay grade. She paused. You gave me the logs. You helped transmit the stand-down. That will be part of the record. The record, he said, with an inflection that wasn't quite bitter but wasn't neutral either. It matters, she said. I know how it sounds, but it matters. He looked at the workstation screen. Then he nodded, once, a small motion that could have meant several things, and went back to doing nothing in particular. Mez. The extraction helicopter arrived 43 minutes later. It came in over the north face, which was the only approach that gave it adequate clearance from the terrain and the compound structure, and it put down in the open area between the gun emplacements and the vehicle track, because that was the only space wide enough to accommodate the rotors. The blizzard had not improved. Riley watched the landing through the comms building's narrow east window, and she thought that whoever was flying that aircraft in these conditions was either exceptionally good or exceptionally motivated, and probably both. Two people came off the bird at a run, crouched against the rotor wash. A crew member and a medical technician in cold weather gear. She met them at the comms building door. The medic took one look at her leg and said something unprintable. It's been a long night, she said. When did you break it? Approximately 5 hours ago. He looked at her with the expression of someone recalibrating their understanding of what a person could do on a broken leg. Can you walk to the aircraft? I've been walking on it for 5 hours, she said. I can make it 50 more meters. She made it. It wasn't pretty, and her body was very clear about how it felt about the whole situation. But she made it, and she got herself through the side door of the helicopter and sat down on the canvas bench and let the medic do what medics did while the bird lifted and banked south into the dark and the blizzard swallowed Fort Black Hollow behind them. She was unconscious before they cleared the ridge line. She came back to herself in pieces. Warmth first. Real warmth, the sustained, even warmth of an interior space with functional heating rather than the relative absence of cold that had passed for warmth inside the compound. Then sound. The background hum of a medical facility, equipment, distant voices, the specific acoustic texture of a space with multiple people doing multiple things at low volume. Then pain, which arrived with the specificity and persistence of something that had been waiting patiently for her to be conscious enough to receive it. Her left leg from the knee down felt like it was packed in heated gravel. She opened her eyes and looked at it, elevated, immobilized, wrapped in something that was emphatically not her improvised splint. An IV line in her right forearm. Both hands wrapped in something soft and warm that she took a moment to identify as heated pressure bandages for the frostbite damage. She was in a medical bay. Military. From the layout and the equipment, but large enough and clean enough to be a forward operating base rather than a field position. A nurse was at the station across the room, her back to Riley, making a notation on a tablet. Riley watched her for a moment, and then she said, "Where am I?" The nurse turned, young, with the specific economy of motion that came from working in high-tempo environments where wasted movement cost time. "F.O.B. Harlan," she said. "You've been out for about 6 hours." "What time is it?" 11:40. Riley looked at the ceiling. Nearly noon. The fire mission had been scheduled for 0400, 8 hours ago. She had been lying in this bed while 8 hours of consequences accumulated somewhere outside this room. "Is there a Colonel Draymond here?" she asked. "I can check," the nurse said. "Please." The nurse left. Riley looked at her hands and the heated wraps and thought about what came next. She knew what came next. In the broad sense, there would be a formal debrief, an investigation, a chain of inquiries working backward through the relay node traffic, and the mission authorization in Mercer's comms package. There would be questions. A lot of questions. And at some point in that process, she would be asked to give a full accounting of everything she'd done in the compound, all of it, including the things she'd done without authorization. She'd destroyed military property. She'd entered a hostile installation without orders. She'd engaged compound personnel. She'd made a unilateral decision to transmit a warning to Allied command from an enemy communications center. She'd negotiated with a foreign military officer and made tactical decisions based on intelligence she'd collected independently without verification by any superior officer. None of that was by the book. Not even close to by the book. She was thinking about how to frame it when the door opened. Colonel Draymond was shorter than she'd expected from his voice. Late 50s, solidly built, with the weathered, economical face of someone who had spent a significant portion of their career outdoors and in poor conditions. He came in without a medical escort, pulled a chair from the wall, and set it beside her bed and sat down in the way of a man who had been doing this kind of thing long enough that the setting didn't matter to him. He looked at her hands, at her leg, at her face, which she imagined was not at its best. "Sergeant Hart," he said. "Colonel, how are you feeling?" "Better than I was," she said. "Worse than I'd like." He nodded. "The leg is a clean fracture, fibula. They're saying 6 to 8 weeks." "Okay. The hands are first and second degree on 3 fingers of each. They'll heal." He paused. "There was also a hairline fracture in your left orbital from what the medical team described as blunt force trauma." "Guard at the armory," she said. "He had a good elbow." Draymond looked at her for a moment. "I want to go through what you gave me on the radio, the relay node data, the traffic logs." "Did Voss's package transmit cleanly?" "Yes. We received it about 20 minutes after you went wheels up. Our intelligence people have been working it since." He leaned forward slightly. "The lateral authorization channel you identified. We've traced it back 2 relay hops so far. It connects to a coordination network that we have been looking for approximately 8 months." Riley said nothing. "What you pulled out of that comms building last night," he said, "gave us more usable intelligence on that network than everything we'd collected in the prior 8 months combined." She looked at the ceiling. "Captain Mercer," she said. "In custody," Draymond said, "as of approximately 3 hours ago. He was picked up on the Eastern Approach Road, about 12 kilometers from the ridgeline. He told the team that recovered him he was conducting an extended reconnaissance sweep. Alone. In a blizzard. Alone. In a blizzard." Draymond's voice was flat. "The rest of the team, your team, had returned to the FOB and reported you killed in action. Mercer had filed the initial KYA documentation before we even had you on the helicopter." Something in her chest did something complicated. Not surprise. It wasn't surprise. It was the specific feeling of having suspected something and having the confirmation land differently than the suspicion anyway. "He was efficient about it," she said. "Yes," Draymond said. "And the man from the compound, the unmarked uniform." Draymond's face changed slightly. "Not much, but enough." "That's a more complicated situation," he said. "He got out." "He got out," Draymond confirmed. "We have assets working on locating him. The vehicle he used was found abandoned about 30 kilometers east of the compound. He's in the wind." A pause. "We have the network data you pulled. That's going to do more damage to his operation than capturing him last night would have." "That sounds like something people say when they didn't capture someone," she said. "It does," Draymond said. "It's also true." She looked at him. He looked back at her without flinching. "There's going to be a formal investigation," he said. "Into the mission, the authorization chain, Mercer, the intelligence failures that let a compromised comms package go out pre-mission. You'll be required to give a full accounting." "I know," she said. "Your actions inside the compound are going to be examined," he said. "All of them." "I know that too," she said. "Sergeant Hart." He stopped, reconsidered something. "There are people in the formal process who are going to push back on the decisions you made last night. The unilateral entry, the sabotage, the communications intercept. They're going to argue that an unauthorized solo operation inside a hostile installation, regardless of outcome, represents a significant command authority issue." "They're not wrong," she said. He looked at her. "About that being a command authority issue," she said. "They're not wrong. I did all of that without orders. I made every one of those calls myself." She paused. "I'd make them again." "I know," he said. "I need you to know that I know it was out of bounds," she said. "I'm not going to stand in front of an inquiry board and tell them I was just following the mission. I made the calls. They were mine. I'll answer for them." Draymond studied her for a moment with the expression of someone who has heard a lot of people talk about accountability and is calibrating whether this is the real version or the performed version. The aid station, she said. I need to know that's documented, that the targeting data was for non-combatant infrastructure. That goes into the record. It's in the record, he said. We verified independently. The coordinates matched a Level 2 medical facility, a supply depot, and a satellite staging area for non-combatant evacuee processing. He paused. 314 patients at the medical facility at time of mission. 314. She'd known the number was around 300. Voss had said approximately. Hearing it precise and confirmed was different. Okay, she said. Are you all right? He asked. She thought about how to answer that. I'll get there, she said. He nodded. He stood up and she expected him to leave, but instead he moved to the window and stood there with his hands clasped behind his back, looking out at whatever was outside the FOB medical bay. She watched him. I'm going to tell you something, he said, to the window rather than to her. Not for the record, off the side of what we just covered. All right, she said. I've been in command positions for 22 years, he said. I've debriefed soldiers coming out of situations that went sideways in every direction you can imagine. I've read after-action reports on operations that failed, on operations that should have failed and didn't, on operations that succeeded at costs nobody wanted to pay. He paused. I don't say this to people often because it tends to go to their heads and then they do something stupid that gets them killed. He turned from the window. What you did last night was not by the book, he said. On that point, the inquiry board will be correct. But the judgment behind it, the specific way you assessed each decision point and acted on it, that's not something we manufacture. That's something a person either has or doesn't. She didn't say anything. The board is going to look at what you did and see the deviations, he said. My job is going to be to make sure they also see the result. 314 people. He picked up the chair and moved it back to the wall. 6 to 8 weeks on the leg. Use the time. He left. She looked at the ceiling and listened to the hum of the medical facility and thought about 6 to 8 weeks and what came after them. But Mercer came to see her the following afternoon. She didn't know he was coming. There was no warning, just the door opening and then him standing in the doorway with his hands at his sides and the expression of a man who has been processed through enough custody and questioning that some of the surface has been stripped away and what's underneath it is harder to read. He was still in uniform. She noticed that, rank insignia intact, for now. He stood in the doorway and looked at her and didn't say anything immediately, and she looked back at him and waited. I heard you were awake, he said. Close the door, she said. He closed it. Don't sit down, she said. He stopped halfway to the chair. She looked at him. He looked at her leg, her hands, the general evidence of the last 36 hours. I filed the KYA report, he said. I know you did, she said. I heard. You were in a ravine, he said. In those conditions, with a fall like that, you didn't check, she said. He stopped. You called the withdrawal before anyone confirmed whether I was alive or dead, she said. You didn't send anyone to look. You didn't call out. You gave the order and you left. She kept her voice even. Not controlled even, like she was suppressing something. Just even, because she'd had enough time with this to know where she stood with it. That's not a field assessment call. That's a decision you made for a specific reason that had nothing to do with the mission. He was quiet. The comms package, she said. He looked at the floor. Look at me, she said. He looked up. Did you build it yourself, she said. The secondary frequency. Did you put it in there, or did someone give you a package and tell you to issue it? A long pause. Does it matter? He said. Yes, she said. It matters a great deal. Because if you built it yourself, you knew exactly what you were doing from the first day of this mission. And if someone gave it to you, there's a question about when you understood what it was and whether you had any moment where you could have chosen differently. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully categorize. Shame was in it somewhere, but shame was too simple a word for all the things his face was doing. I was approached 8 months ago, he said. By who? I didn't know his name. I still don't, officially. He had the right authentication, the right access credentials. He presented as a senior intelligence coordination officer. He paused. He knew things. About my finances. About some decisions I'd made that I hadn't put in any report. He stopped. She waited. He wasn't threatening me, Mercer said. Not directly. He was offering a relationship. Information exchange. He said it was aligned with command objectives, lateral coordination. And you believed him, she said. I wanted to believe him, he said. That's different. Yes, she said. It is. He looked at the floor again. Hart, he said. I need you to know, Smeep. Don't, she said. He stopped. Whatever you were going to say, she said. Don't. Not to me. Say it to the investigators. Say it to the inquiry board. Put it in a sworn statement. But don't bring it in here and say it to me like it's something I can do anything with. He stood there for a moment. He looked older than she remembered him looking, which was probably the combined effect of the last 36 hours on both of them. Okay, he said. You should go, she said. He went. She stared at the door after it closed and thought about 8 months. 8 months of Mercer knowing what the frequency was, what it meant, who was on the other end of it. 8 months of missions that she and the rest of the team had run while Mercer issued communications packages he knew were compromised. She tried to identify what she felt about it and found the answer was complicated and multi-layered and not something she was going to resolve in a hospital bed at FOB Harlan the day after a broken leg and frostbite and everything else. She turned her head and looked out the window. The weather had cleared. The sky outside the FOB was a hard, flat blue, the kind that came in the wake of a major storm system when the atmosphere had wrung itself out and had nothing left. Snow on the ground, pristine and unbothered, going all the way to the tree line. She looked at it for a while. The formal debrief happened on the 4th day when the medical team cleared her to sit upright in a wheelchair for extended periods. They brought her to a conference room in the FOB's command building. 3 investigators, a legal officer, a recording technician, and Colonel Draymond, who sat off to the side and said almost nothing for the first 2 hours. The lead investigator was a major named Trent Calloway. He was thorough, precise, and had the particular kind of professional neutrality that made him difficult to read, which was almost certainly the point. He worked through the timeline from the pre-mission briefing forward, and Riley answered every question completely and without evasion. When they reached the armory, Calloway set his pen down. Sergeant Hart, he said, you made a decision at that point to sabotage the installation's weapons infrastructure without orders, without authorization from any superior officer, and without the ability to verify your intelligence assessment through standard channels. That's accurate, she said. Walk me through the decision. I assessed the fuse storage and determined that disabling it would prevent the fire mission without destroying the ordnance itself, she said. Destroying the ordnance would have caused a catastrophic secondary explosion that would have killed everyone in the compound, including myself. Disabling the fuses was a targeted measure. The authorization basis for that decision. There wasn't one, she said. In the standard sense, I made a field judgment call. Calloway looked at her. You understood at the time that this action was outside your operational authority. Yes, she said. And you proceeded anyway. Yes, she said. Why? She looked at him. She thought about giving him the military justification, the proportionality assessment, the civilian protection framework, the specific provisions under which a field operator could make unilateral decisions in the absence of command communication. All of that was real and applicable, and she could cite it accurately. Instead, she said, because there were 314 people in a medical facility 40 kilometers away, and I was the only one in a position to do anything about it. The room was quiet. That's the reason, she said. I can give you the regulatory framework that supports it if you need it for the record, but that's why I made the call. Calloway wrote something down. He looked up. The intelligence you collected from the communications center, the relay node data. Major Voss provided this to you voluntarily? He showed me the traffic logs and provided access to the secure partition, she said. I transcribed the header codes manually. He then packaged the full logs for transmission to Allied Command on my request. What was your read on Voss's motivation? She considered this carefully. He told me the mission was wrong, she said, that the authorization channel didn't match the standard chain. He'd verified the target coordinates independently and knew what was actually on the other end of the fire mission. I think he'd been sitting with that for 3 days and hadn't found a way to act on it inside his own chain. She paused. I gave him one. You trust his account, Calloway said. I trust his actions, she said. He had multiple opportunities to signal for help or undermine the stand-down transmission. He didn't take any of them. Make of that what you will. Calloway made a note. The debrief continued for another 2 hours. When it was done, Calloway collected his materials with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had exactly what they needed. And the legal officer said something procedural about the timeline of findings, and the recording technician stopped recording, and one by one, the people in the room began to leave. Draymond stayed. When it was just the two of them, he moved from his chair along the wall to the chair closest to her wheelchair and sat down. How did that feel? He said. Like a debrief, she said. Calloway is good, he said. He's going to write a fair report. I know, she said. The findings will take 3 to 4 weeks, he said, during which time you are technically under review, which means no operational assignment. I'm on crutches for 6 weeks, she said. I wasn't expecting an operational assignment. No, he said. He looked at his hands. The network data your intelligence pulled is being worked by 3 separate teams right now. It's already produced 2 secondary leads that our people are pursuing. He paused. The man from the compound, the unmarked uniform, we have a preliminary ID. We're not releasing it yet, but we have it. She looked at him. The network he runs, Draymond said, goes deeper than one fire mission. Last night was one thread in something that's been operating for a long time. He paused. The thread you pulled is going to unravel a lot of it. She sat with that. What happened to Cole? She asked. The guard, Draymond said. The one from the compound. Yes. He thought for a moment. Processing, along with the rest of the compound personnel. He'll be interviewed, assessed. He looked at her. Is there something specific about him? He was at the door when I transmitted the stand-down, she said. He could have stopped it. He didn't. Draymond nodded slowly. I'll make a note. She looked at the window, the hard blue sky again unchanged. Colonel, she said, when the findings come back, when this is done, what happens to my unit assignment? Draymond was quiet for a moment. That, he said, is going to depend on several things, some of which are above my level. He paused. Some of which are not. She looked at him. What I can tell you, he said carefully, is that there are people in this command structure who have been watching what happened at Fort Black Hollow and asking questions about what kind of operational framework should exist for situations like that one. Situations where the standard chain is compromised and the field operator is the only functioning node in the system. She was quiet. That's a nascent conversation, he said. Nothing decided, nothing formal. He stood up. But it's happening. He left her alone in the conference room with the hard blue sky out the window and the faint hum of the FOB around her, and she sat in the wheelchair and thought about what kind of operational framework she would build if someone asked her to, and how long 6 weeks on crutches actually was, and whether the man in the unmarked uniform was somewhere warm right now, and whether that would still be true in 3 months. She thought it probably wouldn't be. She looked at her hands in their bandaging and thought about Fort Black Hollow burning in the dark, and the aircraft holding overhead, and Voss at his workstation, and Cole in the doorway with his rifle loose at his side, and the 314 people in the aid station who'd never know how close it had been. She thought about all of it. Then she reached for the call button to ask for someone to wheel her back to the medical bay, because her leg hurt and she was tired and there was going to be a lot of work to do when the 6 weeks were up. The 6 weeks were not what she expected. She'd anticipated the slow, grinding boredom that came with forced inactivity, the particular frustration of a body that was used to being used sitting inside 4 walls with nothing to do but think. She'd been through recovery before. A torn rotator cuff 2 years ago, 2 weeks of concussion protocol the year before that, the accumulated small damages that anyone in her line of work collected over time. She knew what recovery felt like. She was prepared for it. What she wasn't prepared for was how much of the 6 weeks wasn't recovery at all. The first week was medical. The second week was investigators. By the third week, she understood that she had walked out of Fort Black Hollow, or been carried out, technically, on a helicopter, into something much larger than a single mission debrief, and that the network data she'd pulled from Voss's comms building was producing consequences in real time that people kept briefing her on in fragments. each fragment revealing a slightly larger piece of the picture. The relay node traced back through 4 relay hops, not 2. The coordination network it connected to had been operating for at least 3 years, spanning multiple command theaters. By the end of week 3, 7 people had been placed under investigation. By the end of week 4, 3 of those had been formally charged. Mercer was one of them. The charge was not abandonment of a wounded soldier in the field, though that was in the documentation. The primary charge was material support of a hostile intelligence network, compounded by deliberate corruption of classified mission materials. His legal officer had argued extenuating circumstances, the approach, the coercion, the financial leverage, and those arguments were probably going to reduce the final disposition. Riley knew this and had accepted it in the way she accepted most things she couldn't change, directly, without pretending it was something other than what it was. She was not asked whether she thought the extenuating circumstances mattered. Nobody asked her that. She thought about it anyway, in the evenings when the medical bay was quiet and she was doing the prescribed exercises for her leg that hurt enough to keep her attention focused, and she never arrived at a clean answer. Mercer had been leveraged into something. That was true. He had also been in a position where he could have reported it and had chosen not to, repeatedly, over 8 months. Both of those things were true at the same time, and the space between them was where the actual human being lived, complicated and irreducible. She did her exercises. She read the briefing fragments they brought her. She ate the terrible FOB food and had opinions about it that she kept to herself. She slept more than she had in years because her body simply demanded it, and she didn't fight it. On the 38th day, they told her about the man from the compound. His name was Gerald Prowse. She would not have guessed that name. She'd constructed something more dramatic in her head without meaning to, some name that matched the specific quality of authority he'd carried in that briefing room. The unmarked uniform, the patience of a man who had spent years insulated from consequences. Gerald Prowse was a name that belonged to someone who coached youth sports and drove a sensible vehicle, and the mismatch between the name and the man was something she found herself thinking about for a long time after the investigator told her. He had been a senior coordination officer, genuine in that designation, for approximately 22 years before his activities inside the lateral network were first flagged. He had built the network carefully and over a long time, using his genuine access and his genuine credibility to establish channels that looked, from every official angle, like authorized intelligence coordination. The authorization codes were real because he had the authority to generate real codes. The relay nodes were undetectable because he'd built them using legitimate infrastructure. He was exceptionally good at his job, the investigator told her, both his official job and the other one. He was arrested at an airport outside a city she'd never heard of, 16 days after he'd driven away from Fort Black Hollow in the blizzard, by a team that had been built using the specific traffic pattern data she'd transcribed by hand in that comms building in the dark, with stiffened fingers and a pen light. The handwritten notes from her chest-rig notepad had been entered into evidence. She thought about that. The notes that she'd made in the subroom off the main corridor, writing fast and in the dark. Her handwriting that had always been bad, and that night had been barely legible, and those pages sitting now in an official evidence file in a formal legal proceeding. There was something about that specific detail that she couldn't fully articulate, a thought that stayed just at the edge of formation. The investigator gave her the charge sheet. Prowse faced multiple counts across 2 jurisdictions: conspiracy to commit fraud against Allied command authorities, unauthorized diversion of classified intelligence assets, facilitation of an operation targeting non-combatant infrastructure, and a separate set of charges that the investigator described carefully and in full, and that added up to a probable sentence that the investigator did not specify, but that Riley was capable of calculating for herself. He was not going to be in a position to run anything for a very long time. She looked at the charge sheet for a while. Corvich, she said, the one who left with him. In custody, the investigator said. He's cooperating with the investigation. He'll face his own disposition based on the full scope of his involvement. Okay, she said. The investigator gathered his materials. At the door, he paused. Sergeant Hart, he said, the intelligence your actions produced has been substantial. I want you to know that the people working this case understand where it came from. She looked at him. That matters to us, he said. She nodded once. He left. She sat with the charge sheet for a while longer, Then she set it on the bedside table and went back to her exercises. Calloway's findings came back on day 42. She was in the physical therapy room, learning how much weight her leg would accept under the supervision of a PT specialist who was encouraging in a way that she found mostly useful and occasionally exhausting when Colonel Draymond appeared in the doorway and waited for her to finish the set she was on. She finished it. She looked at him. His face told her enough of the answer before he said anything. The inquiry board reviewed all actions taken during the unauthorized entry and operational period inside Fort Black Hollow, he said. They've made their findings. Tell me, she said. The board found that your actions, while outside standard operational authority in multiple specific instances, were undertaken in good faith based on accurate intelligence assessment and produced documented outcomes that directly prevented significant loss of non-combatant life. He paused. They found no basis for disciplinary action. She stood on her recovering leg and breathed. There's a formal note in the record, he said, acknowledging the command authority deviation. It'll be there. I want you to know that going in. I know, she said. That's fair. There's also a commendation, he said, for the intelligence collection, the mission outcome, the stand-down coordination. He paused. The citation is thorough. She looked at him. The PT specialist in the corner is pretending not to listen, she said, and doing a pretty good job of it. Draymond glanced at the PT specialist, who was studying something on his clipboard with the intense focus of a man thinking about absolutely nothing except that clipboard. Come to my office when you're done here, Draymond said. She came to his office 40 minutes later, still in her PT clothes, moving with the specific gait of someone whose leg was functional, but reminding them constantly of its opinions about everything. His office was Spartan. 2 chairs, a desk, a single window, no photographs. A map board on the wall with nothing on it, which she found more interesting than a map board with something on it. The blank space of a decision not yet made. He was behind the desk when she came in. He gestured at the chair across from him, and she sat. The commendation is going to be formally presented at a command level, he said, probably in about 3 weeks, once the investigation reaches a stable enough point that they can do it without it being entangled in the ongoing proceedings. Okay, she said. Before that happens, he said, I want to talk to you about something. She waited. The conversation I mentioned, he said, about what kind of operational framework should exist for situations like Fort Black Hollow, where the chain is compromised and the field operator is the last functioning node. He folded his hands on the desk. That conversation has progressed. How far? She said. Far enough that I've been asked to bring a proposal to the command council, he said. A small unit, specialized, operating with a different authorization structure than standard special operations, one that accounts specifically for scenarios involving compromised command chains, lateral threats, intelligence operations that cross standard operational boundaries. She looked at him. It's not a new idea, he said. Variations of it have been proposed before. They never got traction because the case for why it was necessary was always theoretical. He paused. It's not theoretical anymore. You're talking about a unit built around the kind of thing that happened at Fort Black Hollow, she said. I'm talking about a unit built for the kind of situations where Fort Black Hollow is the scenario that happens, he said, where the threat comes from inside the chain rather than from outside it, where the standard response protocols are themselves the vulnerability. She was quiet for a moment. How many people, she said. Small, 8 to 12 to start, selected for specific competencies, intelligence assessment, independent operation, communications, close quarters capability. He paused. The person running it would need to be someone who had demonstrated they could make the right calls without a chain to refer to. Someone who understood both the operational side and the intelligence side. She looked at the blank map board on the wall. You're offering me command, she said. I'm offering you the conversation about command, he said. What I'm proposing to the council isn't finalized. There are people who will push back. There are resource arguments, authority arguments, precedent arguments. It may not get approved. But if it does, she said. If it does, he said, I want you running it. She looked at her hands on her knees. The frostbite damage had healed cleaner than the medics had initially projected. She'd been told to expect some lasting sensitivity in the tips of 3 fingers, and that's exactly what she had. a low-level reminder that would probably never fully go away. "I'm a sergeant," she said. "You'd be promoted," he said. The command structure of the unit would require it." "I don't have command experience in the conventional sense." "No," he said. "You have something different from conventional command experience, which is specifically what this needs." She looked at him. "Sir," she said, "I need to ask you something directly." "Go ahead." "This unit," she said, "the authorization structure you're describing, the one that accounts for compromised chains and lateral threats, who oversees it?" He looked at her steadily. "That's the right question," he said. "I know it is," she said. "That's why I asked it." "The proposal includes a dual oversight structure," he said, "command council and an independent inspector with direct reporting authority outside the standard chain." He paused. "The specific design of the oversight is something I've been working on carefully, because I understand what the wrong answer to that question looks like." "Fort Black Hollow," she said. "Prowse had a unit," he said, "unofficially. No oversight, no accountability. He built it over 22 years inside systems that trusted him because he'd built the systems that trusted him." He paused. "What I'm proposing is the opposite of that. A unit with a clear, legitimate purpose, clear boundaries, and accountability built into the foundation rather than added as an afterthought." She sat with that. 3 weeks, she said, "until the commendation." "Approximately." "I want the proposal document," she said. "The full draft. I want to read it before I agree to anything." "That's fair," he said. "And I want input on the oversight structure," she said. "Not veto, input." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Yes." She nodded. She stood up and he stood up, and she was almost at the door when she turned back. "The inquiry board note," she said. "The one about command authority deviation." "Yes, it stays in the record," she said. "I don't want it removed, whatever comes next." He looked at her with the expression she'd first seen in the medical bay, the one that was calibrating whether the accountability was real or performed. "It stays," he said. She left. The commendation ceremony was on day 63, 3 weeks after the conversation in Draymond's office, on a clear morning at FOB Harlan that was cold without being hostile, the kind of cold that reminded you winter was ending rather than the kind that argued for the permanence of everything. Her leg was out of the immobilization brace. She walked with a slight pull on the left side that the PT specialist said was probably going to resolve over the next 4 to 6 weeks and might leave a very mild residual stiffness. "Not a limp," he'd said. "A suggestion of a limp, under fatigue." She'd accepted that prognosis and filed it in the same category as the fingertip sensitivity. Things that would be permanent reminders of a specific night in a specific place, and that she preferred to think of as data rather than damage. There were 12 people at the ceremony. She'd been told it would be small, and it was. Draymond presented. The citation was read by a major she didn't know, and she stood in a straight line and listened to it, and the words were formal and precise and described a version of what had happened at Fort Black Hollow that was accurate in every specific and still felt like it was describing someone else. After the citation was read, there was a pause in the protocol, and someone started clapping, and the others joined, and she stood in the middle of it and looked at the wall above their heads and thought that she had no idea what to do with applause, had never known what to do with it, and this occasion was no different. Draymond stepped forward and pinned the commendation. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Sergeant Hart," he said. "Colonel," she said. "Good work," he said. It was such a plain thing to say, such a deliberately understated thing, that she almost laughed. She didn't, because the moment wasn't the right container for it, but she felt it. "Thank you, sir," she said. After the ceremony, she found a corridor that was empty and stood in it for a while, not avoiding anything, just standing in the quiet for a moment before the next thing started. She thought about the ravine, not Fort Black Hollow, not the compound, not Voss or Cole or Prowse or Mercer. The ravine itself. The 30 feet of free fall and the 4 seconds she'd counted on the way down, the crunch of impact, the first moment of lying face down in the snow and taking inventory of what still worked. That moment had been the beginning of all of it. Not the mission brief, not the deployment, not any of the things that had led to the ravine. The moment of lying in the snow and deciding what to do next was where the real story started. She thought about the 9 words. She still didn't know who had said them. She knew who had given the order, Mercer. But the words themselves, the specific arrangement of 9 words that had ended the possibility of rescue and started everything that followed, she'd never been able to retrieve those from anyone's account. Her team had been debriefed. The withdrawal was documented. The words were somewhere in the transcripts, probably. And she had never asked to see them because she'd realized at some point that knowing them wouldn't change anything about what they had cost, and what they had set in motion. She stood in the corridor and breathed, and after a while the thinking settled into something quieter, and she walked back toward Draymond's office because she had a proposal document to finish reading, and comments to submit, and a decision to formalize. She gave Draymond her comments on the proposal document 10 days later. There were 14 of them, covering 4 areas: the oversight structure, the selection criteria for unit personnel, the activation protocol for independent operations, and the documentation requirements for post-operation review. Some of them he accepted as written. Some of them he pushed back on, and they argued about 2 of them in the specific way of people who were arguing about something that mattered and knew it and weren't going to settle for the wrong answer just to resolve the argument. The oversight structure was the one she cared most about. The dual reporting, she said, the independent inspector. I want it written so that the inspector has authority to suspend operations, not just observe, not just report, actually halt a mission if they assess it's outside the authorized scope. That's a significant constraint on operational flexibility, he said. I know, she said. I'm asking for it anyway. He looked at her across the desk. You're designing a cage around the unit you're about to run, he said. I'm designing accountability into the unit I'm about to run, she said. There's a difference, and it matters. Prowse ran 22 years without anyone who could stop him. I'm not Prowse, but I'm not the only person who'll ever run this, and I can't know who comes after me. He was quiet for a moment. You'll find that constraint frustrating sometimes, he said. Probably, she said. That's not a reason to remove it. He accepted the comment. The proposal was submitted to the command council on the 4th week after the commendation. She was not in the room when it was discussed. She was told the discussion took 3.5 hours and involved significant pushback from 2 members of the council, and that the final approval was not unanimous. She was told all of this by Draymond afterward in his office, standing, because she'd arrived while he was standing and neither of them had moved to sit down. It passed, he said. She nodded. The 2 dissenting council members put their objections in the formal record, he said. Both centered on the independent authorization structure and the oversight design. One of them specifically cited that the oversight was too restrictive. I'll take that as a compliment, she said. I thought you might, he said. He gave her the activation documents. She signed them. Her hand was steady, and the signature was no better than it usually was, which was not very good, and she thought that was probably fitting. You'll have 8 weeks to select personnel, he said. Training protocol will run concurrent with selection. The unit won't be operationally active for approximately 5 months. Understood, she said. You'll need to start thinking about who you want, he said. She was already thinking about it, had been thinking about it since the conversation in his office 6 weeks ago, organizing it in the back of her mind the way she organized everything under pressure, systematically, without forcing conclusions before the data supported them. She had a list of names, preliminary, provisional, people she'd worked with or been briefed on, whose specific combination of skills matched what the unit would need. She also had one name that wasn't from any briefing or any prior operation. Voss, she said. Draymond looked at her. He's in the disposition process, she said. I want to know what his status is. He's a foreign national, Draymond said carefully. A former officer of an adversarial military. His cooperation has been noted. His disposition is pending. He showed me the traffic logs, she said. He helped me authenticate the stand-down. He was sitting on intelligence about a corrupt operation inside his own chain, and the moment someone gave him a way to act on it, he did. She paused. That's a specific kind of person. I want to know if there's a legal and procedural pathway that gets him into a consultancy relationship with this unit. That's a very long road, Draymond said. I know, she said. I'm asking if it exists. He looked at her for a long moment. I'll make inquiries, he said. Bam. She went back to the medical bay that evening, not because she needed to. She'd been cleared to the barracks 3 weeks ago, but because she had left a book there that she'd been reading in 15-minute increments during the weeks of recovery and had never finished. It was a novel, something one of the nurses had lent her without much ceremony, and she'd read about half of it and had opinions about it that she had not yet been able to resolve into a final position. The medical bay was quiet. Evening shift. She found the book on the small shelf above the bed she'd occupied for 5 weeks, exactly where she'd left it, and she stood there for a moment in the room that still smelled like antiseptic and recycled air and the particular warmth of a space designed to keep people alive while they healed. The nurse who had been on shift the morning she woke up, the young one, the economical mover, was at the station across the room. She looked up. "Sergeant Hart," she said. "I came back for my book," Riley said. "I know," the nurse said. "I've been keeping it from the cart." Riley looked at her. "We get a lot of patients who don't come back for their things," the nurse said. She said it plainly, without drama, the way she said everything, as a fact about the world she worked in. "Thank you," Riley said. "How's the leg?" "Functional," Riley said. "Has opinions?" The nurse's expression shifted slightly. Not a smile exactly, but the precursor to one. "They usually do," she said. Riley tucked the book under her arm and walked out of the medical bay and down the corridor and out of the building into the evening air, which was cold and clear and smelled like snow somewhere further up the mountain. She walked back to the barracks. Not quickly. She let the leg do what it could do at its own pace, and she walked. And she thought about the 8 weeks of personnel selection, and the 5 months of training, and the unit that didn't exist yet but would, and the kinds of situations it would exist for. She thought about the people who would be in it and the decisions they would be asked to make, and the accountability structures that would hold those decisions to account. She thought about Prowse in custody, facing charges that named specifically and publicly what he had built and what he had used it to do. She thought about Mercer, somewhere in a legal process that would end in a number of years that was not yet fixed. She thought about the 314. She thought about the fact that most of them didn't know her name and never would, and that this was exactly how it should be. She reached the barracks and went inside and sat on her bunk and opened the book to the page she'd stopped at. She always marked the page with the cover's dust jacket flap, had done it since she was a kid and had never changed the habit. And she read until the light was insufficient, and then she turned the lamp on and kept reading. She finished it at 2200 hours. The ending was not what she'd expected. It wasn't a resolution in the clean sense. It was more of an arrival, the specific kind of ending where the character reaches a place that is both new and somehow always where they were going, and you understood at the end that the journey had been about getting there rather than about any single thing that happened along the way. She sat with the closed book for a while. Then she got out her notepad, the new one, the field notebook she'd started after the original had been entered into evidence, and she wrote 8 names. Her starting list. The people she was going to begin looking at for the unit. Some of them she knew well. Some of them she'd only read about. She wrote them in her bad handwriting and looked at the list and thought about what each name meant and what each person had that the unit needed. Then she turned to a fresh page and started on the questions she would need to answer before any of it could move forward. Questions about training protocol, about operational scope, about the specific language in the activation documents that she wanted to revisit with Draymond before they were finalized. She wrote until midnight. Outside, the mountain was dark and still, and the snow that had come after the blizzard had settled into the landscape with the permanence of something that intended to stay. But the worst of the cold was over. You could feel it in the quality of the air, the specific difference between cold that was retreating and cold that was digging in. The season was turning. She capped her pen and closed the notepad and turned off the lamp. In the dark, she lay with her left leg elevated on the pillow she'd been using for that purpose for 6 weeks, because the PT specialist had said it still helped, and she had no particular reason to argue, and she looked at the ceiling she couldn't see. She thought about the 4 seconds of free fall, the count she'd kept on the way down. She'd spent a long time in her life being underestimated, not always for the same reason. Sometimes it was her age, sometimes her rank, sometimes the specific way she looked, or the way she moved, or the particular combination of quiet and competence that certain people in certain positions found threatening enough to dismiss preemptively rather than deal with directly. She'd learned early that the dismissal was usually about the person doing it rather than about her. and she'd stopped taking it personally somewhere around her 4th year in service. What she hadn't expected, what Fort Black Hollow had taught her in the specific and irreversible way that only certain nights could teach certain things, was that the underestimation of others could become a kind of resource. Not because it felt good to prove people wrong, not because the reversal was satisfying in any triumphant sense, but because the space that dismissal created was operational space, room to move, room to make decisions without anyone watching closely enough to interfere. The people who had watched her fall into that ravine and decided she wasn't worth checking on had handed her something without knowing it. She'd spent one night spending it. Now she had 5 months. She closed her eyes. 3 days before the unit's first training cycle began, a transfer request landed on Draymond's desk. He brought it to her in person rather than routing it through the standard administrative chain, which told her before he said anything that it was something she'd been waiting for. It was Voss. The process had been longer than either of them had expected and shorter than either of them had feared. His cooperation with the investigation had been extensive and documented. His intelligence value had been assessed at the highest tier. The legal and procedural pathway that Riley had asked about, the one that Draymond had said was a very long road, had been navigated by a team that Draymond had quietly assembled over the preceding months, and it had ended in a consultancy arrangement with a specific scope, specific limitations, and specific oversight requirements that had been designed with the care that such arrangements required. She read the transfer document. "He agreed to the conditions," she said. "All of them," Draymond said, without pushback. She thought about Voss in the comms building, writing the message slowly, and her reading the embedded duress signal, and the specific moment of recalibration on his face when he realized she'd caught it. She thought about him accessing the secure partition without hesitation when she asked, and packaging the traffic logs while the aircraft held overhead. "When does he arrive?" she said. "Next week," Draymond said. She put the transfer document in the growing file on her desk and nodded. "Good," she said. But the unit's first day of training was unremarkable in the way that beginnings were usually unremarkable. 9 people in a room that smelled like fresh paint and industrial cleaning product, which meant the space had been prepared specifically for them and was not yet a space they'd made their own. Chairs arranged in no particular order. Maps on the walls that were accurate and current. Equipment in crates that hadn't been opened yet. She stood at the front of the room and looked at them. 8 people she'd selected and 1 she'd requested. 9 different histories, 9 different sets of skills, 9 different reasons for being in a room that nobody outside a specific circle at Allied Command knew existed. The youngest was 24. The oldest was 41. Between them, they had experience spanning combat operations, intelligence work, communications, logistics, and one, Voss, sitting in the back row with the posture of a man who was somewhere genuinely new and was keeping himself very still while he worked out what that meant, who had experience spanning a completely different tradition and was here anyway. She looked at them and thought about what to say. She had prepared remarks. She had organized them carefully during the previous week, a clear statement of mission scope and unit purpose and the specific values she wanted to establish from day one. It was good material. She'd worked on it. She set it aside. Fort Black Hollow was not a clean operation, she said. Nothing went according to plan. The chain was compromised. The intelligence was incomplete. The conditions were as bad as conditions get, and almost everything I did was unilateral and unauthorized. She paused. The outcome was the right one. The process was not. She looked around the room. This unit exists because of that gap, she said, between outcome and process. Our job is to close it, not by giving ourselves permission to do whatever we want without accountability. That's how Prowse built what he built. Our job is to close it by being good enough that the right decision and the authorized decision are the same decision, and by building a structure around ourselves that can tell the difference when they're not. She paused. You're here because somebody assessed that you could do that. I believe the assessment. Prove me right. The room was quiet. Then the person in the second chair from the left, a specialist named Theo Garza, 28, intelligence background, who had been watching her with the specific attention of someone who came in with expectations and is adjusting them in real time, said, "What do we call the unit?" "We don't have a designation yet," she said. "That's on the list." "What's it called on the list?" he said. She almost smiled. Provisional Unit Hart, she said, until someone comes up with something better. That'll work, Garza said. She picked up the first crate from the stack beside her and set it on the table. Let's start, she said. They started. The days that followed were not easy and not supposed to be, and Riley ran them the way she ran everything, without pretending the difficulty was smaller than it was, without manufacturing confidence she didn't feel, without asking anyone to do anything she wasn't willing to do herself, which sometimes meant doing things she had no business doing on a leg that still had opinions about itself. She wasn't the best in the room at everything. She was the best at some things. She was average at others, and she said so plainly when it came up. Because a unit built around a single person's capabilities was a unit with a single point of failure, and she had not come this far to build a single point of failure. Voss was better than she was at signals analysis. She told him so and gave him the lead on the communications training module and watched him become, over the following weeks, something different from what he'd been in that comms building. Less contained, less braced for consequences that kept not arriving, gradually more present in the work, in a way that was visible in small things, the way his posture changed during technical sessions, the way he began offering assessments without waiting to be asked. She watched it and noted it and said nothing about it, because some things were better observed than commented on. Garza was better at field intelligence synthesis. Another member of the unit, a woman named Cassie Rourke, was better at close quarters assessment than anyone Riley had encountered in years of working with people who did close quarters assessment. Riley built the training around what each of them did best and let the friction between their different skill sets generate the kind of cross-training that a classroom couldn't produce. It was not smooth. There were conflicts, 2 in the first month that required her direct intervention and 1 that she let run because she assessed correctly that it would resolve itself better without her in it. There were days when the training hit a problem that she didn't know how to solve, and she said so, and they worked on it together. And sometimes they solved it, and sometimes they put it in the log as an open question and moved on. She filed a report with Draymond every 2 weeks. He read them. She could tell from the quality of his responses, which were specific enough that he'd clearly gone through the material rather than skimmed it. He pushed back twice. She pushed back on his pushback once, and he accepted her reasoning. It was a functional working relationship, which was all she'd asked it to be. The independent inspector arrived 6 weeks into training. His name was Leland Park, and he was 60 years old and had the demeanor of someone who had been checking things for a long time and had developed no strong feelings about being liked while doing it. He sat in on 2 days of training, read 3 months of documentation, and had a 2-hour meeting with Riley that covered the activation protocol, the scope definitions, and the specific oversight provisions she'd pushed for in the proposal. At the end of the meeting, he said, "You wrote the cage." "Yes," she said. "Most people don't write their own cages," he said. "Most people aren't thinking about who comes after them," she said. He looked at her for a moment, then he said the things he needed to say about the formal review process and when the next inspection would be, and he left, and she went back to training. Chet. The unit's first operational deployment was on a Tuesday, 5 months and 11 days after the first training session in the room that smelled like fresh paint. The mission brief was 45 minutes, and the intelligence was solid, and the chain was clean, and the authorization was documented in full, and nobody's comms package had been compromised by anyone. She checked the last point herself, with Voss the night before, going through the encryption verification line by line. He caught one discrepancy that turned out to be a formatting error rather than anything meaningful. She thanked him for catching it anyway. Before they went wheels up, Garza looked at her and said, "Level with me. Are you nervous?" She thought about it. "No," she said. "You should be," he said. "That means you haven't thought about everything that can go wrong." "I've thought about a great deal of what can go wrong," she said. "I'm still not nervous." "What's the difference?" he said. She looked at him. "Nervous is when you don't trust your preparation," she said. "I trust the preparation. What happens when we get there is a different question." He considered that. "Okay," he said. "Good enough." The aircraft lifted. She looked out the window at the ground dropping away and the dark spreading out in every direction. And she thought about another aircraft 5 months ago, lifting her away from a compound in a blizzard while she was unconscious, and how the 2 flights felt different in every way that mattered except the one that didn't. She was still here. She had counted the seconds on the way down. She was still counting. That was the thing about surviving something. It wasn't a destination. It was a practice. You chose it again and again. Not once, not definitively, not in a single dramatic moment where everything resolved into clarity. You chose it in the cold and in the dark, and with a broken leg and with bad handwriting, and with the specific, imperfect human machinery of a person who had never been what anyone expected, and had stopped waiting for that to change. Below the aircraft, the ground was dark, and the mountains were white, and the mission was ahead of them, specific and real and hers to navigate. She turned away from the window. "All right," she said to the unit arranged in the aircraft around her. "Let's go through it one more time." Garza pulled out his map. Roark leaned in. Voss put on his headset and began running the frequency check, his hands moving with the confident efficiency of someone who had found his place in the room. They went through it one more time. The most dangerous thing you can do to someone who refuses to be finished is convince yourself they already are.